My family owns a remote homestead in the rugged mountain foothills of Montana, a region where the history is deeply embedded in the terrain. It was a copper mining claim back in the 1910s, and before that, it intersected several early hunting trails. My grandfather built the main timber lodge there in the early 1970s, surrounded by 40 acres of dense pine and jagged granite that cuts right into thousands of acres of protected national forest. I grew up exploring those timberlines, but quite honestly, that land has a rhythm that feels increasingly hostile. When I was 7, I was playing near an old generator shack at the edge of the creek one day. I looked through the early autumn frost and I saw a man standing by a disused logging trail. He was wearing a heavy jacket and a grease-stained wool cap, his face entirely obscured by a thick beard. He didn't move. He just stood there until I blinked, and then the trail was completely empty. When I described him to my grandmother, she sat down and went sort of pale, to be honest. She said that I had just described her uncle, a timber cruiser who had walked into a blizzard and disappeared a decade before I was even born. Now, the property became a site of deep grief later on. You see, my older brother who taught me how to track into the mountains, he actually ended his life near an abandoned limestone kiln on our boundary line when I was about 21. He was always paranoid too about a specific iron grating over an old ventilation shaft where he used to watch the horizon from. He told me that the metal down there rings weird, don't ever step near it without me. 4 days after his funeral, a localized mudslide, one that didn't even register on any regional environmental sensors, hit only that specific shaft. It didn't just move the dirt too, it completely undermined the earth beneath the kiln, violently shearing the heavy iron frame in half and dropping the twisted metal 60 feet down into the dark abyss down there. He also used to claim that the wilderness was selective about what it lets you hear. He'd hear our mother's voices calling him from the interior of like an unhitched empty horse trailer sort of thing. He'd hear the rhythmic sound of a two-man crosscut saw tearing through timber right behind his shoulder at times, but when he turned, there was never anything there but brush and dead needles. I've also got my own encounters with that place. Like, one night while I was scanning a ridge for coyotes with some binoculars, I saw a cluster of blue pale lights hovering just above a boulder field. They moved in a sort of rigid vertical line, ascending a sheer cliff face as if climbing a structural ladder. I tried to tell myself at the time that it was a reflection from a distant fire tower, but the lights were self-contained and pulsed like a generator cycle. The most aggressive moment, though, that happened when I was 22. So I was walking a perimeter fence line that I'd maintained for years at this point. The woods, they were dead still that day. No birds, no wind, just a really sort of heavy silence. And suddenly, a sharp, authoritative voice barked my name right behind my ear. I spun around and a heavy chunk of raw copper slag, the kind from an old smelter, whistled past my temple and cracked against a cedar post with a spark, is the only way that I can describe it. There was nobody in the trees, though, and that type of industrial byproduct isn't really found anywhere on our side of the ridge. While inspecting the post where the slag hit, though, I found a small hidden hatch under the floorboards of the generator shack nearby. Inside was a cramped, active squatter's nest, heaps of modern canned food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a notebook filled with meticulous handwritten logs of our family's exact daily movements, spanning the last, what I can only guess is like 3 years. Whoever had been living directly beneath our feet had evacuated only minutes prior to, leaving a pair of cheap, warm binoculars on the dirt. The structural failures, though, were the final straw for us. So, I was out near a stand of old growth larches that April. It was a really still afternoon, and without a breath of air, one of the massive trees just sort of, well, for a lack of a better term, snapped at the base with a sound like a gunshot. A minute later, the trunk next to it shattered. Then the next one by one, 5 huge trees imploded in a straight line, moving directly toward me, like an invisible mass was plowing through them straight toward me. I didn't stay for the 6th. I got out of there as quickly as I could. I would be lying if I said that I didn't still feel a pull to that place. I've even had reoccurring nightmares about it for years. I guess I'm sort of lost in the timber a bit still. I also remember when I lived there that I always stumbled upon half-buried log cabins that weren't even on our maps at times. Sometimes I could hear a heavy grinding sound coming from beneath the floorboards, like iron on stone or something. And while I don't claim to know what any of this means, I just feel that there's a specific memory in that place that has absorbed some sort of tragedy or something. And sometimes I just get this feeling that the pressure needs to vent. This all went down back in the winter of 1996, during a brutal seasonal freeze-up on a remote mountain pass in the high country plains of Colorado. I was renting a converted rail signal shack that bordered an abandoned limestone quarry and an old freight train siding. It was a completely isolated patch of high country, but I was a freelance technical writer and lived alone most of the time, relying on the total silence to hit my deadlines. Or at least I did until that November. The old quarry complex next to my shack consisted of a skeletal corrugated iron equipment shed and decaying wooden loaded ramps as well. And about a month into the freeze, the exact same week that my older dog passed away, the weird audio stuff started popping up. I would be sitting on the old woodpile at dusk, just sort of thinking about what I was going to write, when I picked up a sort of thumping sound coming from the direction of the rock-crushing pit. It sounded exactly like the heavy leather boots of maybe a quarry worker walking down a wooden ramp. But then a vocalization would cut straight through the freezing air as well. But it didn't have a normal human pitch to it. It carried the sort of flat metallic scratch of an old CB radio transmission, played through like a busted speaker. It wasn't throwing out actual words. It was replicating the exact double whistle that I always used to signal my dog when it was time to feed him. A sudden wave of cold dread hit my chest as well, but I forced myself to rationalize it. I figured that it was just the mountain wind vibrating through the hollow iron pipes of the quarry fencing at the time. But I did go indoors and lock the heavy deadbolt tight. 10 minutes later, though, the source sort of shifted a little bit. The upstairs loft window was propped open an inch to let some air in at the time, and I heard that identical double whistle right outside of the glass, immediately followed by my childhood shorthand nickname, a specific name that only my immediate family ever uses. Now, the shack is perched right on a sheer rock bluff. There's absolutely nothing outside that second-story glass but like a 40-foot drop straight down into a jagged field of granite boulders. And so I slammed the window down so violently that the wooden frame rattled, and I dragged my mattress into the central hallway for the rest of the night that night. But the actual verification occurred 2 weeks later. So I was running an online audio feed for a small group of contractors, analyzing some regional logistics maps over a live mic, and my microphone gain was up and my monitoring headphones were turned up to maximum volume so I could check the background hiss. When, without warning, a sharp spike tore right through the audio feed. It seemed to come from the direction of the dark quarry yard outside, and it sounded like a voice bellowing secure. Apparently the old commercial blasting directive used before a detonation. My chat log instantly flooded with messages from the guys, asking who was in the room or standing right outside of my window. I wasn't experiencing an isolated hallucination, that much was clear. Everyone on the feed had heard it clear as day. And the voice, it had this strange, sort of resonant quality to it, like it was being amplified right out of the rusted iron machinery itself. While inspecting the exterior perimeter of the shack the next morning to look for loose wires or hidden speakers, I noticed a narrow crawlspace access panel under the low porch deck that had been pried completely open. Inside of there was some massive piles of shredded damp winter clothing, a rusted hunting knife, several dozen raw rotting deer bones that had been meticulously scraped clean by something. The soil was also completely stamped flat where someone or something had clearly been, and perhaps there for hours. But last Thursday, well, that was definitely the worst one. So I was standing near the fuel tank finishing a mug of coffee when the old automated warning siren out by the rail line began clanging erratically. And suddenly, a voice began transmitting across the stone yard. The sound source didn't travel at a normal human pace though. It moved like a high-speed projectile, literally zipping from the northern rock face to my immediate property fence in just a matter of seconds. It wasn't a shout. It was delivered in a completely flat sort of mechanical or monotone sort of way. It carried the exact cadence of an automated emergency broadcast, and my stomach, upon hearing it, just plummeted. I bolted inside, knowing that stuff shouldn't be working, and I locked every door and spent the remaining hours of darkness inside the tiled bathroom with a flashlight and my firearm. Throughout the night too, periodically, I swear that I could hear something brushing up against the side of the house. And while it was a bit of a windy night, there's just nothing around the house that really could have caused that. No trees, no bushes, nothing. My tenancy agreement expires in 15 days and I have completely made my mind up that I won't be staying any longer. So I was staying at this isolated old farmhouse out in the scrubby, dry part of West Texas about 5 years ago. It was the middle of autumn, pushing 1 in the morning, and the whole place was dead quiet. My cousin and I were hanging out in the central hallway, and there was a washroom to the right, a sunken living room straight ahead, and a heavy wooden door leading into the attached garage on the left. He stepped out to the garage to grab a socket set or something, leaving me standing there in the dim yellow overhead light of the hallway. When, as I turned to head toward the living room, I caught sight of this massive ash-grey shape. Whatever it wasn't human-shaped at all. It looked like a 7-foot-tall jagged pillar of dense soot that had somehow solidified in mid-air. It didn't run or slide. It moved in this weird, erratic, staccato sort of jumping way, almost like a scratched film reel skipping frames. It zipped from the back fireplace right into the dark kitchen, and by the time that I freaked out and reached the doorway, I realized that the room was a total dead end with no other way out, and the silence in there at that moment was deafening. Now, I didn't see this thing again after that. In fact, I didn't see the damn thing again for nearly 3 years. By that time, too, I had moved into a 5th-floor apartment in Minneapolis and tied the whole thing down to just me seeing things. I was sitting up in bed reading one night when suddenly the room just felt weird. I looked over toward my open walk-in closet, and I swear to you that that same soot column was vibrating in the corner. Its edges weren't solid. They were constantly fraying and reforming like smoke in a draft. I reached for my phone to get the torchlight so that I could see this thing properly, and by the time that I looked back, the corner was just empty drywall again. The physical stuff, though, that started about 48 hours after this. So I woke up at dawn with this freezing numb sensation on the inside of my right forearm. I know, kind of random, but when I checked it in the mirror, there was a patch of skin that had turned bone white, as if the pigment had been totally vacuumed out into a perfect, sharp rectangle. It took 4 full days for the color to come back as well. That's when the static started. I began getting this brutal sleep paralysis, but the room wouldn't go dark. It went totally grey and grainy, like an old tube TV tuned into a dead channel. I'd be pinned to the mattress while that jagged pillar of soot hovered right over my chest, making this dry scratching sound like dead grass rubbing together. The absolute worst part, though, well, that happened last Wednesday and is why I'm here. So I heard a sharp, clear two-note whistle, the exact one that my uncle used to get my attention when I worked on his farm as a kid. It came right from the small guest bathroom as well. I walked in, expecting to find a loose window pane or a pipe acting up or something, but the room was fine. My uncle has been living in a retirement community in Arizona for like 6 years at this point. He hasn't even been in this time zone, let alone my apartment. I went to check the vanity anyway, just to prove to myself that I was losing it. And that's when I really started to panic. Because hidden in the very back of the medicine cabinet, a shelf I literally never even used, were 3 baby teeth. The molars. They were completely clean as well, but when I picked them up, they had this odd smell to them. It's hard to describe the smell, but it stank, that much was clear. I'm starting to think that this thing isn't just following me because of the places that I live. It feels like it's anchored to my actual shadow a little bit, because no matter how many times I pack up and change my zip code, the static always finds a way back into my room. So I travel around the Midwest for my job, doing logistics auditing, and tonight I was staying at a chain motel right off the interstate. After a long drive, I wanted some fresh air, so I decided to walk over to a nearby 24-hour convenience store to grab a bottle of water. To get there from my motel, you have to walk along a gravel utility lane that runs behind a small, mostly abandoned strip mall. It's pretty dark back there, I'll be honest, save for a few lights over the delivery doors. I had my headphones around my neck, not plugged in, just resting there, when I rounded the back corner of the empty storefront. About 20 feet ahead of me, standing completely still next to a row of commercial dumpsters, was a man. He was wearing a heavy winter parka zipped all the way up, which was completely bizarre, given that it's like mid-May and currently about 72 degrees out. But the detail that made my stomach really drop was that he was completely barefoot. His pants were rolled up to his shins, and his feet were resting right on the broken gravel and shattered glass by the dumpster. He was facing away from me, staring intently at the brick wall. My immediate thought was that he must be high out of his mind or having a severe mental health crisis or something. I've worked in urban logistics for a decade now and have seen plenty of people under the influence, so my standard protocol is just to avoid eye contact and back away quietly. I stopped, intending to turn back toward the main road. But the second that my shoe crunched on the gravel, he didn't turn around. Instead, he did this incredibly rapid, fluid, backward shuffle. It wasn't a normal walk or run. He literally skated backward toward me on his bare feet, keeping his back entirely to me. The speed was unreal as well. He covered 15 feet of rough, jagged gravel in about 2 seconds without making a single sound of distress or losing his balance even once. By the time that I realized what was happening, he was less than 3 feet in front of me, his back still turned, blocking the path. He was breathing heavily, a sharp, rhythmic wheezing that sounded totally mechanical. I sort of scrambled backward upon seeing this, pulling my hands up into a defensive posture and yelled, Hey, back off!" The moment that I spoke, he froze. He slowly turned his head over his shoulder. His face wasn't sluggish or spaced out like a typical drug user. His eyes were completely wide, bloodshot even, and hyper-focused on, well, what I think was my throat. He didn't yell, and in a completely flat, monotone whisper, he said, "You have the wrong shoes for the gravel. They're too loud. Swap them." He then looked back down at his own bare feet, which were actively bleeding from the sharp stones, though his face didn't register a single hint of pain. He looked back up at me and repeated the exact same phrase, with the exact same cadence. Honestly, I didn't answer because I was just too stunned by the whole thing. Plus, every instinct in my body told me that I was in immediate danger. I turned around and just sprinted full tilt back toward the well-lit motel parking lot, and I could hear his feet slapping against the pavement behind me for a few yards, fast and heavy, before the sound abruptly stopped. When I reached the lobby doors and looked back, the dark utility lane was now empty, and I couldn't see the guy anywhere. I told the front desk clerk about what happened. They called the local non-emergency line to report an erratic person behind the building. I didn't hear anything since then, but I just cannot shake the sheer wrongness of just how weirdly this guy moved. It didn't feel like a guy who was drunk or high or anything. It felt like I was interacting with a broken piece of machinery that was trying to mimic a human, and failing completely. I locked my door, propped the chair under the handle, and I'm just waiting for the sun to come up now so that I can check out and get out of this place. But has anyone else here ever encountered something like this? Or someone moving or speaking with that kind of rigid, sort of unnatural precision? It is the first time that I've ever come across anything like this, and I am just totally weirded out by it. This happened about 5 days ago in a quiet, affluent pocket of Norfolk, Virginia. I'm an 18-year-old student, and my friend and we had reluctantly attended a small gathering at a house in a neighborhood known for being completely safe, the kind of place where people leave their porch lights off because, well, nothing ever really happens. Anyway, around midnight, the group of about 15 people decided to go for a walk down the residential tree-line avenues just to clear our heads for a little bit. Because my friends were sleeping over at my place, the two of us decided to bring our backpacks and heavy jackets with us. The plan was to sort of slip away from the group halfway through, order a rideshare from the sidewalk, and catch a cheaper fare since the walk was bringing us closer to my neighborhood anyway. We were about 3 blocks away from the host's house when a dark grey sedan slowed down to a crawl right alongside of our group. The windows rolled down, and the men inside, there were 4 or 5 of them, started shouting some pretty aggressive nonsense. "Hey, where are you girls heading? Get in, we'll give you a ride," that sort of thing. There were mostly girls in our group, with only 3 or 4 guy friends walking with us. I sort of snapped at them to just keep moving and leave us alone. They did speed off, and for a second, we thought that that was the end of it. We kept walking, laughing it off to dispel the tension. But then we heard the engine roar from behind us suddenly. And before anyone could even turn around, the sedan had literally mounted the curb. It didn't just swerve, it accelerated directly down the wide brick sidewalk at full speed, targeting the back half of our group. It was an incredibly tight and claustrophobic sort of space hemmed in by stone retaining walls and thick hedges. People were screaming, throwing themselves sideways into the dirt and the bushes to avoid being crushed by this vehicle. The car missed my friend's shoulder by mere inches before slamming its brakes, the tires screeching brutally against the pavement. A few of our friends, furious and running on pure adrenaline, marched up to the vehicle to scream at them. The men inside, they weren't angry. They were weirdly dead silent, just staring at each of us with wide, completely unblinking eyes, though the driver had this rigid, fixed grin on his face. When we threatened to call the cops, the driver calmly reversed off of the sidewalk, drove down the street about 50 yards, and pulled over to the side of the road, turning the headlights completely off. We were terrified, but we were a pretty large group, so we decided to stick together in the end and quickly head back toward the host's house. We had barely covered 100 meters when the headlights clicked back on. The car accelerated again, but this time it didn't stay on the road or the sidewalk. The driver pulled the car into a flat, grassy residential lawn, cutting off our path entirely. One of my male friends walked up to the driver's side window, trying to remain completely level-headed, and he told them very clearly that they were going to kill someone and needed to leave. Instead of driving away, the passenger doors flew open. 2 men got out. They didn't scream and they didn't try to start a standard fistfight or anything. Instead, they moved so weirdly, with this sort of franticness about them, completely ignoring our male friend and walking straight toward the girls who were holding bags. One of them lunged at my friend, not trying to hit her, but aggressively grabbed the straps of her backpack, trying to pull her toward the open back door of the sedan. The movement felt terrifyingly rehearsed, too. It was not a chaotic street brawl by any means. It was clearly a coordinated attempt to try and, kidnap someone. I started screaming at the top of my lungs that I was on the phone with emergency services and reading out their license plate number. And the moment that the word police left my mouth, the 2 men froze. Without a word, they let go of the bag, slipped back into the sedan, and the car blacked out its lights again as it tore around the corner. We ended up sprinting back to the house after this and calling the police, but because the street was so dark and the plate was partially covered in mud, I didn't actually get the plates. There wasn't much that they could immediately do, besides promise to increase patrols in the area. What keeps me awake, though, now isn't just the threat of the car, it's the detail that I noticed right before they drove away. You see, when the passenger grabbed my friend's backpack, his jacket sleeve pulled back and he was wearing a high-end heavy-duty security uniform shirt underneath of his coat, complete with a clipped radio mount on the shoulder. Which means that they weren't just reckless thugs pulling a dangerous prank or anything. They knew exactly how the neighborhood layout worked, and they knew where all the blind spots were, and they were looking for a specific opportunity, and clearly had some gear to back it up. We're not going back to that area at night ever again, and I personally will not be walking the streets late at night again for, a long time. For context, my building requires a key fob to pass the front lobby, and the elevators won't even move unless you scan your fob for your specific floor. It's an upscale place, mostly medical professionals and state employees, so it's usually pretty quiet. I had ordered some groceries through an app because I was nursing a bad ankle sprain at the time. It was around 9:25 in the evening, and the delivery driver texted me saying that she was in the elevator heading up to the 4th floor. My apartment is right at the end of a long, windowless hallway, lined with dark blue carpeting that completely dampens the sound of footsteps. I opened my back door a little bit when I heard the elevator chime down the hall. I watched the driver, a woman in her late 20s, walk toward me carrying 2 heavy reusable bags. About 15 feet behind her, though, there was a guy walking. He was dressed in plain, casual clothes, jeans, and a dark hoodie, but his posture was incredibly stiff. He was matching her pace perfectly, stopping exactly when she stopped, almost like he was trying to hide in her blind spot. I assumed he was just a neighbor from the elevator, so I stood in the doorway to take the bags. The driver handed them to me. We exchanged quick pleasantries, and I started to close the door. That's when the guy didn't walk past. He stopped right behind the driver, less than an inch from her back. The driver turned around, startled, and laughed a bit, assuming that he was crowding her. "Oh, sorry, go ahead," she said, stepping to the side. The man didn't move past her. He didn't look at her either. He kept his eyes locked entirely on the open gap of my doorway. His face was completely blank. No anger, no expression at all, but he was holding a heavy yellow fiberglass measuring tape in his right hand or something like that. He slowly extended the tape, letting it click loudly in the quiet hallway as the metal stretched out toward my doorframe. The driver then realized that something was deeply wrong. Her smile dropped, and she backed away toward the elevator. I tried to push my door shut, but the guy took one incredibly fast, rigid step forward and planted his foot right in the jam. He didn't try to force his way in, though. He just stood there, keeping the door wedged open. Through the gap, I could smell something awful, though, almost like a wet dog, but way worse. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice cracking a bit. I grabbed the door handle, trying to force the door shut against his boot, but he had immense steady leverage. Again, he didn't yell, he just kept the measuring tape extended through the crack, touching the metal tip against the inside of my door frame. Then he said, 32 inches. The frame is out of alignment. We need to clear the width." He wasn't acting like a burglar or anything, or a violent attacker. His tone was clinical and detached, and it made my skin crawl. From down the hall, the delivery driver bravely screamed, "I'm calling the police right now. Get away from that door." The second that she shouted the word police, the man didn't panic. He just slowly retracted the measuring tape, pulled his foot out of the door frame, and turned around. He didn't run. He walked with a unbothered stride back toward the exit stairwell, pushing the heavy fire door open without making a sound. I slammed my own door, locked everything, threw the security latch, and called 911 immediately. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the stairwells and the perimeter, but they didn't find anyone. However, when the officer came to my unit to take my statement, he pointed at the floor just outside of my door. On the dark blue carpet, right where the man had been standing, there was a heavy, white, powdery residue. It looked like crushed drywall or lime or something. The officer tracked the white footprints back down the hallway, but they didn't lead to the elevator or the stairs or anything. The prints, they stopped abruptly in front of a small locked utility closet in the middle of the hallway, a space where the building has its water shutoff valves and things like this. The door was still locked, but there was a faint smear of white powder on the brass handle. The police, they think that he might have slipped into the building hours earlier by tailgating a tenant and then had been hiding inside of the cramped utility closet, just waiting for a door on my floor to open. I haven't slept a wink. Every time the building's HVAC system clicks on and the air pressure shifts, my apartment door slightly rattles against the latch and my heart sort of drops. I'm currently packing a bag to go and stay at a hotel across town. I don't care about my lease anymore, to be honest. Whatever he was measuring my door for, I think that it was just a cover, and I don't want to be here when he comes back with the tools to finish the job. I'm a 29-year-old mother living in a rural pocket of Western Oregon. Last weekend, for the first time since having my daughter, I finally had a free afternoon to do some solo trekking. My property borders on a massive network of timber company land, thousands of acres of trees, steep ravines, and unmapped logging tracks. I've grown up exploring these ridges, so even though there's absolutely zero cell service out there, I felt completely confident going alone. Now, because it was a heavy logging zone a decade ago, the terrain is scarred with old, overgrown skid roads that lead absolutely nowhere. I was about 2 hours into a steep ascent up a secondary ridge when the afternoon took a very bad turn. So I was moving through a narrow, shaded draw when I noticed a really weird chemical smell. It wasn't a campfire or trash or anything. It smelled like heavy industrial solvent and burnt rubber, completely out of place for the deep woods. A few hundred yards later, the trail dipped into a dry creek bed, and that's where I ran into them. It was a group of 3 men. They didn't have backpacks, water bottles, or any hiking gear whatsoever. They were just sitting on a fallen log in a damp heat, wearing heavy mud-caked work boots and matched grease-stained canvas jackets. I immediately felt that cold spike of situational awareness. I kept my pace steady, offering a brief nod and a polite afternoon as I tried to pass them on the left. The man sitting in the middle stood up. He didn't just greet me, he stepped directly into the narrow center of the path, forcing me to halt. He didn't look angry, he had this incredibly flat, sort of relaxed demeanor that felt entirely forced. "You're a long way out from the access gate," he said. His voice was loud, but his eyes kept darting past my shoulder, scanning the trail behind me to see if I was alone, I think. The other two men, they also stood up. They didn't speak, they just stepped to the flanks, slowly forming a loose semicircle around me. I kept my hand near my waist. I carry a Glock concealed under my top, and my thumb instinctively hooked the hem of my shirt. "Just doing a loop up to the ridgeline," I said, keeping my voice level and firm. "My husband's meeting me at the timber clearing in 20 minutes. The first man didn't acknowledge the lie. He took a slow step forward, reached into his heavy jacket pocket, and pulled out a large rusted steel wrench. He didn't brandish it like a weapon. He just started shifting it from hand to hand, the heavy metal making a dull clack against his palm each time. "The ridge is closed today," he said, his tone completely monotone. "The company is dropping timber. You need to come down into the hollow with us. We have the gate keys." Now, I know the logging schedules for this county. There hasn't been an active permit for this sector in 3 years at least. More importantly, the woods were dead silent. There wasn't the distant scream of a chainsaw or the rumble of a yarder for miles. I didn't argue, though. I deliberately pulled my shirt up just enough to clear my hip, exposing the black polymer grip of my holster. The man with the wench stopped shifting the metal. His eyes locked onto the firearm, and for a fraction of a second, his rigid expression cracked into pure frustration. He didn't retreat, but he certainly froze. I didn't wait for him to make a decision. I lunged sideways, scrambling up the loose crumbling dirt bank of the creek bed, entirely bypassing their circle. The moment that my boots hit solid pine needles at the top as well, I just broke into a dead sprint. I didn't stay on the main path as well. I threw myself into a steep, unmaintained deer trail that cut down the opposite side of the ridge, ripping through dense blackberry briars that literally tore up my arms and face a whole lot. I ran into my lungs, felt like they were bleeding, eventually sliding down a wet clay slope into a deep limestone ravine that I'd never seen before. By the time that I had stopped to breathe, the silence of the forest returned, but I was completely turned around. The ravine was a dead end, surrounded by sheer crumbling rock faces. When I tried to retrace my steps up the clay slope, the ground, it gave way, and I realized that I couldn't get back up that ridge. I was now trapped in a thick, marshy pocket of old-growth timber, where the canopy was so dense that it felt like twilight at midday. I sat against a rotting stump, fighting off a massive panic attack, trying to map out a compass heading in my head, and that's when the brush cracked to my right. I pulled my firearm, my heart racing, expecting the canvas jackets, but instead, 2 massive mud-stained Great Pyrenees stepped out from the ferns. They didn't have collars and they didn't bark. They just stood there, their thick white coats covered in burrs, staring at me with completely calm and really intelligent eyes. They looked like working livestock guard dogs from one of the distant sheep ranches miles down the valley. They didn't approach me for food or anything. The larger of the two let out a low, soft huff, turned around and began walking deliberately up a faint, near invisible, game trail that bypassed the steep rock wall. The second dog stayed put, looking back at me until I stood up and followed. For an hour, those 2 dogs literally led me through a brutal, trackless swamp, and then over a massive field of unstable granite scree, a route that I would never have attempted on my own. But they kept a steady, methodical pace, never letting me get more than 10 feet behind them. Suddenly, the dense brush broke and I stumbled directly out onto the gravel surface of a decommissioned fire road. And I knew exactly where I was now. It was the lower boundary fence of my neighbor's property. I literally dropped to my knees, sobbing from pure relief and exhaustion. When I wiped my face and looked up to call the dogs over, they were already 50 yards away, trotting back into the tree line without a sound. They didn't even look back. My husband eventually picked me up from the neighbor's house, and we immediately notified the sheriff's department about the 3 men out in the timber block. The deputy who took my report looked deeply unsettled when I described the grease-stained jackets and the industrial chemical smell. He told me that apparently they'd been investigating a series of illicit, isolated chemical dumps and copper theft staging sites hidden deep in the public land grid that month. Thankfully, I'm safe at home now, but I cannot shake the horror of what might have happened if I hadn't have been carrying that day, or if those 2 dogs hadn't have just materialized in that ravine. I keep a pair of heavy cattle dog collars in my car now, hoping that one day I'll see those Pyrenees on the mountain road so that I can find their owner and thank them. But deep down, I think that they belong entirely to the ridges, and so I probably will never see them again. I'm currently 21, but this happened back in 2012, when I think I was about 9 years old. My family had just moved into a brand new housing development on the edge of a small town in Yorkshire, in the UK. Because it was a massive multi-phase construction project, only about 4 houses on our entire street were actually finished and occupied. The rest of the road was an active, dusty construction zone surrounded by temporary chain link fencing, piles of gravel everywhere, and skeletal timber frames. As the only kid living on the street at the time, I spent my afternoons riding my bike up and down the only completed stretch of tarmac there. Because there were always subcontractors, bricklayers, and tradesmen coming and going, I grew completely accustomed to the constant presence of unmarked white transit vans and flatbed trucks. Now, one overcast Tuesday afternoon, I was riding near the entrance of a cul-de-sac that was still mostly a dirt track. A pristine, unmarked white van was parked idling near a pile of scaffolding pipes. As I pedaled past, the driver's side window rolled down. The driver was a middle-aged man, wearing a bright, brand-new, high-visibility vest. He looked incredibly ordinary, like any of the site managers or surveyors that I saw daily. He leaned out, though, and called over to me with a cheerful, booming voice. "Hey, mate, you like football?" I stopped my bike. I had been taught all of the standard stranger danger rules in primary school, but my 9-year-old brain completely compartmentalized this guy as just another builder working on our neighborhood. So I nodded and said, "Yeah." "Do you support United?" he asked, smiling. When I told him that I did, his demeanor became even more enthusiastic. He clicked his tongue and said, "Brilliant. Listen, one of the guys left a brand new signed training ball in the back of my rig today. Brand new in the mesh bag. You want it?" The prospect of a free football completely blinded me to any red flags. I pedaled closer to the passenger side. He didn't hand anything through the window. Instead, he turned off the engine, stepped out of the cab, and walked around to the heavy double doors at the back of the van. He opened them wide, revealing a completely barren, wood-paneled cargo interior. But right at the very back wall of the van, perfectly centered and sitting upright on a small wooden crate, was a pristine white leather football. It looked almost clinical, like a display piece in a shop window, lit subtly by the grey afternoon light pouring through the open doors. "Go on, hop up and grab it out of the back," he said, stepping to the side to give me some space. "My knees are short today. I can't climb up there." Looking back on this as an adult, the precision of the setup makes my stomach just churn. The ball was placed at the exact maximum distance from the bumper, meaning that a child would have to crawl entirely inside the dark interior, completely out of sight from the street, to reach it. I leaned my bike against the curb and walked up to the bumper. I was just about to place my hands on the metal ridge, too, to hoist myself up into the cargo hold, when a booming, furious shout cut through the quiet of the street, Step away from the van now." It was my older brother. He was 19 at the time and had just walked down our driveway to call me in for tea. I have never seen someone move so quickly as he did in that moment. He covered the distance between our house and the van in a dead sprint, stepping directly between me and the driver. My brother, he didn't start a fight or anything, but his posture was terrifyingly rigid. He locked his eyes on the driver and barked, "What exactly are you doing talking to my brother?" The driver's entire demeanor instantly fractured. The confident, booming, friendly builder persona vanished, replaced by a frantic, stuttering panic. His face turned a deep, blotchy red. He was riding past. I just wanted to give the lad a ball," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the main road as if checking for witnesses. "Just being neighborly, mate." My brother didn't yell back. In a dangerously low and calm voice, he said, "If it's a gift, you hand it to me." My brother walked right up to the bumper, reached deep into the van, and snatched the ball off of the crate. The second that the ball was out, the driver slammed the back door shut, scrambled into the front seat, and tore down the unfinished dirt road so quickly that the tires kicked up a massive cloud of grit. We tried to report the incident to the site foreman the next day, but because the van was completely unmarked and we didn't get the registration plate, he told us that we just needed to report it to the police. They did check the contractor logs though, but dozens of delivery drivers entered the site through the main gate every afternoon, so there was no way of being sure. My brother, he still refuses to talk about that day. Whenever I bring it up, he just completely shuts down and changes the subject, which tells me everything that I need to know about how close I actually came to getting into that van, and probably what would have happened to me. What terrifies me though now isn't just the memory of the encounter, it's the professionalism of it. The pristine high-vis vest used as a psychological camouflage to blend into a development site, the carefully chosen prop, and the precise physical positioning of the bait. It wasn't an impulsive and opportunistic attempt. It felt like a highly refined practice system. And I just cannot shake the unsettling feeling that our half-empty street wasn't his first stop, and it almost certainly wasn't his last, too. I'm 19, and for the past 6 months, I've been working the early morning opening shift, 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., at a classic 24-hour highway diner. It's a pretty isolated spot, mostly serving long-haul truckers and regulars who live out in the rural townships. My dad drops me off on his way to his construction site at 4:45 a.m., and my shift manager always ensures that the front doors are locked until exactly 5 a.m. Now, around 2 months ago, a new regular started showing up. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, always wearing a faded beige jacket and a clean baseball cap. The first few times that he came in, he was incredibly soft-spoken and polite. He'd sit in the corner, order a black coffee and a plate of rye toast, and leave a precise $3 cash tip on top of his receipt. Because I handled the register drawer for the breakfast rush, I was always the one cashing him out, and by his fourth visit, I tried to be a good server and had his rye toast already ringing up when he walked to the counter. He froze, looked at the screen, and gave me this intense, wide-eyed smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. "You noticed," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "Is that because you're looking out for me, or am I just hard to forget?" I laughed it off awkwardly, assuming that it was just typical old man banter. But after the next 2 weeks, the pleasantries turned into something incredibly heavy. He started arriving earlier and earlier, sometimes sitting in his idling sedan, sometimes sitting in his idling truck in the pitch-black parking lot at like 4:40 a.m., just watching my dad's truck pull in. One rainy Tuesday, he leaned over the laminate counter while I was counting back his change, and he got so close that I could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on his breath. "Your generation doesn't appreciate symmetry," he murmured, staring directly into my face without blinking. "But your eyes are perfectly aligned. Rare, very beautiful." It completely crossed the line into making my skin crawl. I told my shift manager, a no-nonsense sort of guy, who immediately told me to stay in the kitchen whenever the beige jacket walked through the door. For a week, my co-workers took his orders too, but our diner's point-of-sale system automatically prints the cashier's first name at the very top of the customer receipts, and by the time that we realized that he was collecting them to get my name, he had already pocketed at least 5 of them, I think. The behavior escalated, though, from passive watching to active tracking. If I was in the back prepping salads, he would order a single side of bacon, then a side of hash browns, then a refill, stretching out his meal for 2 hours just to force me to walk past his table. Last Thursday, I had my hair pinned back in a high claw clip instead of my usual low ponytail. I was wiping down the espresso machine when he called out to me from across the aisle. "You changed the anchor point today," he said, pointing a finger at the back of my head. "The ponytail keeps your neck completely straight. I prefer the ponytail." The fact that he was analyzing my physical posture sent a bolt of pure panic through me. My manager decided to pull me off the floor entirely for the weekend, shifting my schedule to a completely different afternoon slot. According to the weekend crew, the man showed up at his usual 5:15 a.m. time on Saturday and Sunday. When he realized that I wasn't behind the register, he didn't order any food. He just sat in booth 4, the exact corner booth that commands a direct, unobstructed view of the employee back room door, and stared at the kitchen swing doors for an hour before finally leaving. But yesterday is the reason that I'm currently packing my things to move into my brother's apartment closer to the city. You see, I was back on the morning shift today. The man came in late, around 11:30, right when the lunch rush was dying down. The diner was mostly empty. He sat in booth 4, ordered his black coffee, and stayed for his usual hour. When he finally got up to leave, he didn't come to the register to pay. He just dropped a $20 bill on the table and walked out the glass doors without looking back. I went over with a damp rag to clear the booth. He had left the mug perfectly centered on the table, but next to the mug, pressed flat against the wood, was a small 3-inch strip of standard beige masking tape. Written on the tape in really neat, sort of architectural block lettering with what looked like a black fine-tip marker was a list of numbers. It was my exact arrival and departure times from the previous week, down to the literal minute. He had been sitting in his car or at the counter with a stopwatch maybe, logging the exact moments that my feet crossed the threshold of the building. But then I noticed that something was tucked underneath the paper napkin dispenser as well. He had taken a plastic coffee stirrer and used it to sort of wedge a small glossy piece of cardstock into the metal base of the dispenser. I pulled it out. It was a Polaroid photograph taken from a low angle, looking upward through the driver's side window of what looked like maybe a truck. But it was a picture of me, taken from the bushes of the edge of the parking lot, completely asleep against the passenger headrest while my dad was idling in the driveway. The edges of the photo had been meticulously trimmed with scissors, so that the frame only captured my face and the specific contour of my neck. On the back of the Polaroid, written in the same clean architectural script, was a single sentence. "The framework is recorded. We are on schedule." I immediately started shaking. I showed my manager, who locked the diner doors and called the state police right away. 2 troopers came out, took the masking tape, the Polaroid, and the security footage from the parking lot. They ran his plates from the outdoor camera, but the truck was registered to a shell leasing company out of Delaware, and the address on the file was a vacant lot. The police told me that They would increase driving patrols around the highway junction during the 5 a.m. hour, and that they would be keeping an eye out for the guy. I am completely done though. I quit my job on the spot and my manager didn't even blame me. I'm currently sitting in my living room with the blinds completely drawn, waiting for my brother to arrive with his truck. The thought though that somebody was standing in the dark timber line outside of our house, taking photos of me through a truck window while I was entirely defenseless, is a level of violation that I don't think that I'll ever recover from. If you work in a public-facing service job, then please, never assume that a regular is just eccentric. Always take the proper precautions that you need to. So I'm 25 years old and finishing up my postgrad degree in Edinburgh, Scotland. I rent a small ground floor flat in a Victorian stone tenement building. The street is usually pretty busy, but my flat sits at the very back of the building, facing a walled-in gravel sort of courtyard that gets almost zero foot traffic. Now last Thursday, I was at my kitchen table prepping for a 2 p.m. seminar. Around noon, somebody knocked on my front door. My flatmate had left for her shift at the hospital about 20 minutes prior, and honestly, my brain just assumed that she had forgotten her swipe card again. I didn't even look through the peephole. A stupid, lazy mistake that I think that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I pulled the door open. Standing on the threshold was a man in his late 20s, wearing a bright blue shirt over a dark hoodie. He was holding a small grey plastic diagnostic box with a digital screen. The second that the latch clicked, he didn't wait to speak to me. He took a heavy, sudden step forward, forcing me to step back into my hallway to avoid him colliding with me. "Gas and grid safety," he said. His voice was incredibly hurried, almost breathless. "There's a pressure drop in the basement main line. I need to verify the intake valve in your kitchen utility cupboard immediately." Before my brain could even process the intrusion, he had already walked past down the narrow hallway and into my kitchen. The sheer speed of it just left me completely stunned, if I'm being completely honest. I followed him though, feeling a bit nervous about the situation. He didn't go to the utility cupboard though. Instead, he sat down directly at my kitchen table, pulling my open laptop toward himself. He began tapping aggressively on the keyboard, but the laptop screen was completely black. It was closed and in sleep mode. He was just drumming his fingers hard against the plastic casing, making a loud, hollow clicking sound. I stood by the fridge, my throat now completely dry. And that's when I noticed some things. First, he was sweating profusely, despite the flat being freezing cold, and his hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold his plastic diagnostic box. Second, I looked at the embroidered logo on his blue shirt. It was for a commercial telecom infrastructure provider, not a gas or utility company. "What are you doing with my computer?" I asked, my voice coming out much sharper than I intended. "The gas valves are in the wall. You know that, right?" He didn't look up at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the blank, black reflection of the closed laptop screen. "We need to verify the local network alignment before we vent the line," he whispered. His tone had completely shifted from hurried and professional at the door to this really weird sort of tone. "The building needs to be quiet. Is the rest of the layout empty?" The hair on the back of my neck stood completely on end upon hearing that. He wasn't checking pipes. He was checking occupancy. I immediately reached into my pocket and dialed my dad. My dad, he works in civil engineering and is usually entirely unreachable on active sites, but by some absolute miracle, he answered on the second ring. I put the phone on speaker and held it out between us. "Dad," I said loudly, keeping my eyes locked on the man's hands, "the telecom technician is inside the flat, and he says that he needs to vent the gas lines because the building is empty. Can you explain the protocol to him?" The second that my dad's deep, booming voice came through the speaker, demanding to know the man's employee ID and contractor number, the atmosphere in the kitchen completely changed. The man stopped tapping the laptop. He slowly stood up from the chair. The manic shaking energy was suddenly gone, replaced by a really rigid, weird stillness. He didn't apologize. He didn't claim that he had the wrong address. He just picked up his grey plastic box, walked past me in the narrow kitchen, and exited the flat, leaving the heavy front door wide open behind him. I slammed the door and locked it, and my dad stayed on the line with me until the police arrived about 15 minutes later. When the officers reviewed the building's external CCTV footage, they found the detail that has kept me from sleeping for about 4 days straight now. The man, he hadn't arrived in a company van, and he hadn't knocked on any other doors in the tenant block. The footage instead showed him sitting on a concrete bin store in the back courtyard for about 3 hours, directly outside of my kitchen window, watching through the glass while my flatmate packed her bag and left for work. The grey diagnostic box that he was carrying wasn't an instrument at all. The police found it discarded in the bushes outside. It was just an empty, hollow plastic shell from a defunct car battery charger. He had dressed up as a contractor, specifically to bypass the building's front security gate, and he had waited for the exact 20-minute window where I would be entirely alone in the back of the property. I have since bought a heavy metal security bar for my front door, and I don't care how loud or familiar a knock sounds anymore. If I don't see a verified scheduled appointment on my phone or something, that door is staying locked. I'm a 23-year-old university student, and this happened a few months ago. So I'm trans, but at this point in my transition, I look entirely and conventionally female to strangers. So I just stepped off a late-night train at an unstaffed, poorly lit suburban station on the outskirts of Adelaide. It was around 11:45 p.m. and the platform was completely deserted. I pulled out my phone to order a rideshare, but the app was lagging terribly due to poor reception. As I walked toward the dark commuter parking lot, a plain, unmarked white sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the passenger window. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a very clean, pressed dark suit that felt entirely too formal for a casual driver. "Hey, the rideshare app is down in this sector tonight," he said. His voice was perfectly modulated, almost like a text-to-speech program trying to sound warm. "A private contract rate, $30 flat at the city centre." Normally, I have intense stranger danger, but it was freezing. My phone battery was at like 12%, and I just really wanted to get home. I hesitated at first, but he smiled, a wide, perfectly symmetrical smile, and unlocked the doors. "Front or back?" he asked. I told him that I'd just hop in the back. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached over, pushed the passenger seat all the way forward against the dashboard, and tilted the backrest down at an unnatural angle. "Please, sit in the front," he said, his tone dropping into a flat and heavy cadence. "The weight distribution in the rear affects the steering alignment. Front seat only." It was a bizarre lie, but the sheer awkwardness of the moment made me just comply. So I got in the front seat. The interior of the car was unnervingly clinical. There were no fresheners, no loose change, no phone mounts, and absolutely no garbage anywhere. It smelled intensely of that sort of new car smell and new carpet. The second that I buckled my seatbelt, I wanted to establish a bit of a safety net, so I pulled out my dying phone and said out loud, just texting my brother to let him know that I'm in a private car and should be home in about 20 minutes. The driver didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead on the dark highway, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned completely white. We drove in silence for about 5 minutes before he started asking questions. But it wasn't normal small talk. He didn't ask where I was coming from or what I did for work or anything. Instead, he asked, "Are you currently unattached to any male partners or anything?" I felt a sudden icy wave of panic. I realized two things instantly. First, he thought that I was a cisgender woman. And second, I needed to play a highly specific aggressive role to completely unnerve him and make myself an unappealing target. I don't do relationships," I said, putting on a harsh, cynical tone. "My last boyfriend was a spineless parasite. I kicked him out because he didn't do a single chore and cried when things got difficult." I expected him to be put off by that, but instead, his head gave a slight rigid nod. "A domestic vacuum is suboptimal for sure," he said, using an incredibly strange choice of words. "I possess high proficiency in laundry, sanitation, and physical maintenance. I'm well suited for a female partner who requires strict orders." The way that he spoke, it just didn't sound like a guy trying to flirt or act smooth or anything. It sounded like AI reading a list of, desirable human traits from a database or something. He kept pushing, though, his questions becoming increasingly clinical and invasive. He asked about my preference in intimacy, phrasing it with terrifying detachment. "Do you prefer friction that is aggressive, or do you require prolonged tactile contact?" Things like this. I leaned hard into my defensive role. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I only like it rough. Cuddling is a waste of time. In fact, I prefer to be the one completely in control." I thought that would scare a conservative, neat-looking guy in a suit. But again, it didn't. His chest expanded in heavy, rhythmic wheezing that passed for a sigh. "Dominance is an acceptable matrix," he said. Then, he complained that the exchange was unequal. I wanted to shift the topic to anything normal, really. "Fine, what's your motivation? What's the one thing that keeps you driving this car every single night?" I expected a human answer, a family, money, dream or something. But he didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty black road ahead and just said, "The maintenance of the vehicle and the collection of structurally sound women." My heart completely stopped upon hearing that. The word wasn't beautiful or pretty. He literally said structurally sound. The wrongness of his phrasing made me realize that I was sitting next to somebody completely detached from reality. I spent the last 10 minutes of the drive completely silent, my hand gripping the door handle, praying for a red light or a police cruiser. When we finally pulled up to the curb outside of my apartment complex, I didn't wait for him to park fully. I shoved the door open while the car was still rolling at a few kilometers an hour, and as I scrambled out onto the pavement, he didn't yell or try to grab me. He just stopped the car, rolled down the passenger window, and stared at me through the gap. In the dim light of the street lamps, I noticed something that I had missed in the dark car. The entire time that he had been driving, he hadn't been wearing any shoes. His bare, pale feet were resting directly on the rubber floor mat, and his toenails had been meticulously painted with a thick, opaque black substance that looked like industrial primer. "Your data has been integrated," is what he said, his face completely expressionless. "We will adjust the parameters for the next transit." He then drove off into the dark before I could even process what he meant. I ran inside, locked my door, and literally threw up from pure adrenaline. I never did call the police because, well, I didn't know what to talk about or say about any of this. But I do still think about that phrase every single night when I look out of my window at the street below. The collection of structurally sound women. I certainly didn't win that interaction by being tough or anything. I think the only thing that kept me from being pulled into the trunk of that car was the lie about my brother waiting for me at the end of the line. From the ages of 14 to 17, my family lived in a rented stone-built converted labourer's cottage in a pretty rural pocket. It was a very old building, thick limestone walls, heavy exposed timber beams, and floorboards that warped and groaned constantly with the humidity. When we first moved in, we just shrugged off the constant pops and creaks as the typical quirks of the historical property. But by the second year, the sounds became entirely too deliberate. The first incident that broke our old house rationalization happened on a Friday winter evening. I was 15 at the time. My dad and I were sitting in the small downstairs snug watching a football match. My mum, my older brother, and my toddler sister had all gone to bed hours earlier. When suddenly, a loud, heavy series of impacts rattled the ceiling. It sounded exactly like somebody in heavy boots rushing down the steep enclosed wooden staircase. The footsteps, they were incredibly fast and ended with the downstairs utility room literally slamming shut. A second later, the clicking sound of the old pull cord switch echoed from inside of the room. My dad, thinking that my brother was messing about, chuckled and called out his name, but there was no answer. He called out my mother's name, still nothing. We both got up and walked into the stone flagstone corridor at this point. The line of light was visible under the utility room door, and my dad pushed the door open, expecting to catch my brother raiding the secondary fridge. The room, though, was completely freezing, and also entirely empty. The pull cord, though, was still swinging slightly in the air, but there was nobody inside, and the tiny window was locked tightly from the inside too. There is absolutely no physical way that my brother or my mum could have made it back upstairs without us seeing them in the narrow hallway at the very least, and the ancient stairs were far too loud to sneak up as well. A few months later, I also had a visual encounter that I still can't think about without my palms sweating a bit. I was alone in my bedroom upstairs, getting changed after school one day. My desktop computer monitor was turned off, creating a dark, glossy mirror right opposite of my bed, and as I pulled a jumper over my head, I looked at the dark reflection of the room, and in the reflection, standing right next to the wardrobe behind me, was a physical shape. It looked like a very short, severely hunched figure wrapped in a heavy dark grey shawl or maybe a blanket or something, but the posture was unnatural and weird. What made my heart completely drop, though, was that I didn't see it in the monitor. Out of the extreme lower corner of my actual peripheral vision, I could see the physical edge of the dark fabric resting against the carpet. I froze for a solid 2 seconds, watching the reflection of the hunched shape slowly tilt its head upward toward the ceiling. When I finally forced myself to spin around, the corner of the room was entirely empty. When I brought it up to my mum the next morning, her face just completely drained of color. She didn't dismiss it. She just sort of whispered that apparently she had stopped using her vanity mirror at night because she kept seeing a low shadow passing behind her shoulder in the glass. The worst part, though, started when my brother moved out for university one day, and I transitioned into the small windowless box room on the ground floor to give my sister her own room. The room, it sat right against the external stone wall of the cottage, directly adjacent to the damp earth of the garden. From the very first night, too, that room felt hostile. The air was permanently thick and smelled faintly of like rotten vegetables. Every single night, right around 2 in the morning, a low rhythmic vibration would start in the floorboards directly beneath my mattress. It wasn't a mechanical hum or anything, too. It felt like a heavy, uneven weight shifting back and forth. And one night, the vibration stopped, and a distinct sound started against the low cottage window right above my head. It was a sort of wet sound, and it was less than 2 feet from my face. I lay there, completely paralyzed, staring at the thin curtains. Then this wet sort of tapping sound transitioned into a slow, dragging friction across the glass, like someone pulling something heavy down the pane. I pulled the heavy duvet entirely over my face, praying for the sun to come up. As I sat there suffocating in the dark, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps inside the room. They weren't coming from the hallway. They started right at the foot of my bed, a slow, heavy dragging sound across the rug, moving toward my head. But the door, it never opened. We finally left that house in 2015 through a tenancy assignment with another family who wanted to move out of the city. During the final walkthrough, the incoming tenant, a quiet middle-aged woman who kept a lot of heavy crystal jewelry around her neck, was inspecting the ground floor box room, and I was helping my dad carry out the last of the cardboard boxes, and I made a bit of a dark joke to my mum about leaving the extra roommate behind. The woman stopped dead in the middle of the room. She turned around, looked at me with incredibly intense and unblinking eyes, and said, "You mean the short one? The one who can't straighten her back?" The breath completely left my lungs. I had not told a soul outside of my immediate family about the hunched silhouette in the monitor, and then she said, "She sits in the corner by the wardrobe because the floor is lower there." She continued, her voice entirely matter-of-fact as if she were reading a property survey. "She doesn't like the light cords. They make too much noise." My mum practically dragged me out of that house by my arm, and we loaded the truck in dead silence. 6 months later, the woman sent my mum an email. She had apparently gone to the local parish records office to look up the historical tithe maps of the cottage or something, and it turned out that before the building was converted into a residential home in the 1950s, the ground floor box room that I had slept in had been a detached stone-walled scullery. And in the winter of 1892, an elderly, arthritic widow who worked the surrounding fields had been permitted to live in the scullery, and she had eventually passed away from hypothermia right against that cold external wall. I used to be entirely cynical about anything paranormal, assuming that everything could be explained by drafty foundations and psychological suggestibility. But there is no rational equation that explains how a complete stranger could describe the exact structural posture of the thing standing behind me in the dark like that. These days, I live in a modern concrete apartment complex now, and I refuse to sleep in any room that has uncarpeted floor or an old-fashioned pull cord switch. I want to state up front that I don't believe in the paranormal, ghosts, or any kind of spiritual residue or anything. I'm a third-year engineering student, and I am pretty much entirely convinced that every seemingly inexplainable event has a rational, mathematical explanation. Whether it's localized auditory hallucinations, complex acoustic echoes, or even some atmospheric pressure shifts, I believe that all of this can explain it. However, with that said, there is one event from when I was 14 that I still mentally reanalyze whenever I can't sleep. At the time, I was attending a strict historic boarding academy just outside of Melbourne. The main campus building was built in the late 19th century, featuring high ceilings, polished timber corridors, and deep concrete basements that housed the older classrooms and locker blocks. It was a Thursday afternoon, around 5:30. The winter sun had already dropped, and the basement level was mostly dark, and also empty since the standard after-school study periods had just concluded. I was walking down the central subterranean corridor to retrieve a textbook that I'd left in the science lab. The corridor was completely silent, except for the heavy thud of my own school shoes. But as I passed an old, decommissioned geography classroom, I heard a sound through the heavy timber door. It was the distinct, ragged sound of somebody sobbing. The crying wasn't faint, too. It was a heavy, breathless sort of hyperventilation sob. What made me freeze in my tracks, though, was the timbre of the voice. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my closest friend at the academy, a girl named Maya. We had been studying together in the library about 20 minutes prior, too. As a 14-year-old guy, I completely froze. I had no idea how to navigate a situation like that, whether interrupting her would be a massive intrusion of privacy, or if I should step inside to make sure that she's okay. The sobbing kept rising in pitch, though, sounding increasingly desperate. I stood outside the door for about maybe a minute, the heavy wood slightly dampening the sound, but finally, the sheer distress of the noise made me decide to open the door. I reached out and placed my fingers on the old, cold brass handle, and right as the latch clicked, a sharp, cheerful voice called out my name from the far end of the dim corridor behind me. "Hey, did you find your book?" A violent wave of physical shivers hit my spine immediately. I spun around so fast that my heels scuffed loudly against the floor. Standing under one of the lights at the top of the basement stairs was Maya. She was wearing her heavy winter school blazer, holding a sleeve of loose-leaf paper and smiling down at me. She wasn't distressed at all. Her eyes weren't red. She looked completely normal. My brain experienced this sickening localized glitch where logic just refused to process physical reality in front of me. I just couldn't even move my legs. Maya jogged down the 3 stone steps in the corridor, looking at my pale face with confusion. "What's wrong with you? You look like you're about to faint. Are you okay?" The exact second that she spoke, the heavy, ragged sobbing inside the geography room behind me just stopped. It didn't fade out or taper into a whimper or anything. It's like it cut off instantly, as if somebody had hit a mute button on an audio track. I didn't tell her what I had been listening to. I didn't want her to think that I was losing my mind or anything. Instead, I sort of forced a laugh out, reached out, and pushed the heavy classroom door completely open. I flipped the row of fluorescent light switches on the wall, and the white tubes flickered and buzzed to life, illuminating rows of empty wooden desks, a dusty chalkboard, and bare linoleum floor. There was nobody inside. There were no secondary doors, no places anybody could hide, and the high windows near the ceiling were completely latched and covered in dust. Maya walked past me into the room, entirely oblivious to the ice in my chest. She looked around for a second, then let out a sharp gasp of just pure relief. "Oh my goodness, they are here," she said, rushing toward the very far corner of the room beneath the radiator pipes. She reached down and pulled out her spare pair of white leather school sports shoes. She had been frantic all morning because she couldn't find them before the afternoon sports rotation. But when she lifted them up, she frowned a little bit. Both shoes had been placed precisely parallel to each other, but they were flipped completely upside down, with the dirty rubber soles facing the ceiling and the lace tongues pressed flat against the dusty floorboards. Now, in the specific Anglo-Indian household that I grew up in, leaving shoes or slippers flipped upside down is considered a severe taboo, an intentional invitation for misfortune, or an indicator that a space has been marked by something hostile. It's an old superstition that my grandmother used to scream at us about, and seeing them placed like that in that dead corner of an empty room, for some reason, made my stomach drop a little bit. Maya laughed it off, assuming that someone from the senior house had played a weirdly specific prank on her and carried them upstairs. Now, I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 times since then. I've looked into the acoustic properties of old brick basements, wondering if Maya had been crying earlier in the day and the sound waves had somehow trapped and delayed inside the unventilated room or something, or if the ventilation shafts from the upper theater had bounced somebody else's distress down into that specific corner. But deep down, I know that the human ear doesn't misinterpret a physical voice from 2 feet away like that. I still don't really believe in ghosts or anything, but I certainly never went back down into that basement corridor alone for the rest of my time at that school. This happened back in the late autumn of 2016 when I was about 19 years old. So my family managed a large-scale, rugged cattle operation in a very isolated, high-altitude section of the foothills in southern Alberta. Because the seasonal frost had killed off the lower valley pastures earlier than usual that year, my dad had leased an unfenced, heavily forested block of provincial crown land about 5 miles up into the timberline to graze our yearling heifers. Checking on them required a demanding 1-hour trek on horseback over rough, rocky logging trails. And on a late October Saturday, I got a late start due to a broken tractor axle, meaning that I didn't head out until about 3:30 p.m. The ride-up went entirely without incident, thankfully. I located the herd, verified that the ponds weren't frozen over, and started the return journey down the mountain around 5:15, I think. The sun was already dropping fast behind the peaks, casting long, dark shadows through the pines. About 2 miles down the trail, the temperature dropped instantly. Not a gradual evening chill too, but a sudden violent plunge that felt like stepping into a freezer almost. At that exact same moment too, I suddenly felt a bit odd, almost like a little bit dizzy or something. Then a bizarre, unnatural wind whipped through the trees, carrying a distinct smell of something dead. My horse, a remarkably steady, seasoned gelding named Jasper, instantly went rigid. He didn't just spook, his entire body began to tremble violently. He fought the bit, throwing his head up and backing away from the right side of the trail, his ears pinned flat against his skull. That's when I noticed too that the hair along his spine stood completely on end all of a sudden. I leaned forward, shortening the reins and trying to use my weight to keep him from bolting into the thick timber. As I struggled to steady him, my head was forcibly drawn to a thick cluster of dead briars just past the modern wire fence line on the right. Standing, perfectly still in the tangle of thorns there, was a dark shape. It was roughly 5 feet tall, I would say, completely devoid of any defined human features, but it certainly possessed a solid, dense physical mass. It looked like a column of light-absorbing charcoal mat against the grey winter brush. And the second that my eyes locked onto it, it didn't turn or duck or sprint. It just vanished instantly. But it didn't fade out or anything. It just sort of blinked out, and there was this sort of vibration through the frozen ground that went with it, followed by what I can only describe as a snapping of a heavy pine branch, as if an intense physical weight had been violently dropped and retracted in like a millisecond. Jasper, though, instantly panicked upon hearing that. He reared back, tore his head away from the reins, and launched into a blind, terrifying gallop down the rocky trail. I could barely breathe, my fingers entirely numb from the freezing wind and the force of holding onto the saddle horn. He didn't stop too until we cleared the timber gate and hit the gravel access road near our home valley. I dismounted to check his legs for injuries, and the moment that my boots hit the ground, a severe, agonizing burning sensation just hit my face. It felt exactly like I'd been sprayed with, bear spray or something. My vision instantly blurred and my eyes began pouring fluid. When I led Jasper into the barn, my mother took one look at me and let out a sharp scream. I walked into the tack room and looked into the cracked mirror over the sink. The whites of my eyes were just completely gone. Both of my eyes were just completely bloodshot, like two solid marbles of dark, bloody fluid. There was no visible sign of blood vessels or spots or anything. It was like my eyes had just gone completely colored red. We went to an urgent care clinic in the nearest town the following morning. The physician was completely baffled by it too. There was no foreign particulate in the eyes, no signs of any trauma or anything, and no burns on the surrounding skin or the eyelids. He ran a battery of pressure tests too, but Structurally, my eyes were functioning perfectly, despite looking like horror movie props. No drops or medications altered the condition, too. My eyes remained completely crimson for nearly 7 weeks as well, before the fluid slowly seemed to sort of reabsorb and finally they cleared. The next afternoon, though, my older brother rode out the exact mile marker on the fence line where Jasper had bolted. He took a heavy flashlight with him and spent about 2 hours inspecting the place. He came back completely quiet. He told me that despite the massive sort of thudding sound and the sound of breaking wood that we both heard, apparently, there wasn't a single disturbed pine needle, a broken twig, or a footprint in the soft clay by the fence. The entire thicket was completely pristine. 10 years have passed since that ride. Jasper passed away from old age a few seasons ago, actually, and I've since moved away from the mountain and taken an office job in the city. I still try to rationalize it as some sort of a rare sort of localized pocket of like gas or atmospheric charge or something. But whenever the weather shifts rapidly and the air pressure drops before a storm, my eyes still ache to this very day, and I still hear that heavy snap of that branch in the dark timber all these years later. I'm a 26-year-old postgraduate student, and I'm sharing this because my sister's long-term partner just moved the last of his belongings out of their flat in Bristol. He didn't break up with her. He simply refuses to cross the threshold of that building ever again. And after what happened 3 weeks ago, honestly, I don't blame him. To provide some brief context here, my sister spent her university years renting a room in an old, damp terrace house that had a notoriously heavy, suffocating atmosphere. She moved out of that property nearly 4 years ago, though. But lately, I've begun to suspect that whatever was anchoring itself to her in that basement room, that it didn't stay behind. My sister now lives in a modern, third-floor apartment complex with her partner. The building, it uses a high-definition digital intercom system at the main street gate, which streams live video directly to a wall-mounted monitor inside of their kitchen whenever somebody presses the buzzer. Now, 3 weeks ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my sister called her partner from her retail job to arrange a dinner date after her shift ended at 6 p.m. He agreed, staying home to finish some freelance work while he waited for her to return. At exactly 4:42 p.m., the apartment intercom chimed. Her partner walked into the kitchen and looked at the digital screen. The street outside was grey and pouring with rain, but standing directly beneath the wide-angle camera lens was my sister. He said that the video clarity was pristine. She was wearing her distinctive dark green wool trench coat, her hair was pulled back into a tight braided bun, and she was holding her black leather tote bag over her shoulder like she normally did. The only detail that felt slightly unusual was her positioning. She was standing entirely sort of motionless, staring directly up into the camera lens with a wide, completely unblinking expression. Assuming that she had just left off her shift early because of the weather, her partner pressed the release button, unlocking the heavy security door 3 floors below. He left the apartment front door slightly ajar so that she could walk straight in as well and went back to the living room. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The building has an exceptionally fast elevator, mind you, and it takes less than like 90 seconds to traverse the lobby from their corridor. Confused by the delay, her partner walked out into the carpeted hallway. The corridor was dead silent, the automatic motion sensor lights completely dark. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. When my sister answered, her voice was accompanied by the distinct noisy background clatter of a busy department store. "Hey babe, I'm just about to head into the stockroom to finish the final inventory count," she said. "I should be out here by about 6. Her partner froze, his spine turning to absolute ice. "Where are you right now?" he whispered. "At the shop. Why, is everything okay?" Her partner is a staunch analytical pragmatist who has never believed in anything paranormal, but he said that the sheer physical terror that hit him in that moment made his breath completely stop. When my sister finally arrived home at 6:15, she walked through the door wearing the exact green dark wool trench coat, her hair styled in the precise braided bun, carrying the exact tote bag that he had seen on the screen 90 minutes prior. Whatever he had released into the secure stairwell, it had never knocked on their door as well. And when the building manager reviewed the digital memory log of the intercom system the following morning, the entry for 4:42 p.m. showed a completely blank grey static screen, which is apparently completely abnormal. This isn't the first time, though, that an anomaly like this has manifested around her. You see, roughly 18 months ago, my childhood best friend, who has known my family for like over a decade and recognizes my sister instantly, was driving through a residential neighborhood on the north side of the city one day. As she slowed down at the zebra crossing, she looked toward the bay window of a vacant, unlit Victorian house that was currently up for auction, and standing behind the glass, staring directly down at her, was my sister. My friend said that she lifted a stiff, completely rigid hand and gave a slow, really weird wave. My friend immediately texted me, "Just saw your sister ghosting around that empty brick house on Westbury Road. What is she doing out there?" I called her back instantly. My sister wasn't even in Bristol that weekend. She had taken a train to Cardiff on Friday morning to visit our aunt, and her phone's GPS logs later confirmed that she hadn't crossed back over the suspension bridge until Sunday night. But the escalation that finally drove her partner out of the apartment, that happened just 4 days ago. So my sister woke up at 3 in the morning to a sudden, violent shift in the room's temperature. She turned over, expecting to see her partner. She saw him there fast asleep, but standing on the floorboard, directly beside her side of the mattress, was a small figure. She said that it looked like a boy, no older than 7, dressed in an oversized, faded grey school uniform. But my sister said that the geometry of the figure was just entirely wrong. The child's neck was elongated and really unnatural, rigid angles, and his face lacked any human definition. His features looked like wet clay that had been smoothed over with a heavy thumb, leaving only shallow, dark indentations where the eyes and the mouth should have been. He was leaning over the edge of the mattress, his face less than 6 inches from her ear, emitting a sort of clicking sound. My sister let out a blood-curdling scream and threw herself across the bed, violently shaking her partner awake. The moment that his eyes opened and the bedside lamp clicked on, the room was entirely empty. She wasn't paralyzed, mind you. She was able to move, sprint, and scream, which completely rules out standard episodes of like night terrors or whatever. Her partner, though, spent the rest of the morning packing his suitcases. He told her that he loves her, but that he just cannot live in a space with something like this. I'm currently looking into short-term lease options to get my sister out of that flat too before the end of the month, and look, I used to think that the stories about doppelgangers or environmental mimics were just internet folklore designed to unnerve people. But after seeing the physical toll that this has taken on her, quite honestly, I'm pretty terrified by this now. If it followed her from that first house, it has spent about 4 years perfecting her exact framework as well. And I don't want her to be around when it finally decides that it doesn't need the intercom to get inside anymore. But for all of you guys who have dealt with this before, how did you get rid of this and what did you do? From the ages of about 5 to 15 years old, my family lived in a cold, sprawling flat situated directly above our commercial electrical wholesale business in an industrial pocket of Manchester in the UK. Because the building was designed for commercial storage rather than domestic comfort, the upper flat was a labyrinth of long, uncarpeted corridors, heavy fire doors, and narrow windows that looked out over our gravel yard. As a child, I possessed a permanent, visceral dread of being upstairs alone in that place. The place always felt weird there, and my anxiety was so severe that during the winter of 1991, when I was about 10 years old, I refused to use the upstairs bathroom after dark, keeping a literal plastic chemical bucket in the ground floor stockroom because the journey up the stairwell made my skin crawl so much. My childhood, though, was defined by a specific reoccurring night terror for the most part. It wasn't a visual sort of thing, it was more of a sensory wave of just absolute confusion and a feeling of intense clinical anger that wasn't my own. I also became a chronic sleepwalker at the time. I would regularly wake up standing perfectly upright in the pitch-black center of the living room, my hands pressed against the cold plaster wall, entirely disoriented. In the summer of 1993, when I was about 12, the passive dread escalated into two distinct physical anomalies. The first occurred on a wet afternoon. I was in the living room watching an old documentary tape on our heavy front-loading VHS deck. Around 5 in the afternoon, the vintage wall-mounted intercom buzzed loudly. It was my mother calling up from the ground floor trade counter, telling me to come down to the back office for some tea. I hit the stop button on the VCR. I distinctly remember the heavy, mechanical clunk of the machine arresting the tape, and I left the cassette inside of the carriage, walked out of the flat, and locked the heavy security door behind me. I spent exactly 25 minutes downstairs in the brightly lit office, eating with my parents and with my older brother. The entire family was accounted for. The shop's security shutters were rolled down too, and the ground floor alarms were active at the time. Now, when I unlocked the flat door and walked back into the living room, the television was buzzing with that grey static. The VHS cassette was no longer in the machine, too. It was sitting precisely in the exact center of the room's rug. It hadn't been dropped or tossed there. It was placed perfectly flat, aligned parallel to the floorboards. When I picked it up and pushed it back into the deck, the machine didn't resume where I had stopped it, too. The tape had been completely rewound to the absolute beginning of the reel. The second incident happened 3 months later, in September. It was around 6 o'clock, and because of the late summer light, the living room was flooded with bright horizontal sunshine. I was sitting at the dining table when the heavy timber door leading to the central corridor suddenly just swung wide open. The flat had exceptionally thick industrial-grade carpeting, and that specific door had a brass rising butt hinge that required a deliberate physical push to even move it. Simultaneously as well, a violent wind tore through the room. It didn't feel like an open window. It felt like a massive volume of air was being sort of suctioned out of the flat into the dark corridor. I walked over to pull the door shut, assuming that a fire exit had been opened downstairs. But the moment that I grabbed the handle, the resistance increased like tenfold. The air pressure became so intense that the wood began to groan against the frame. A loud, high-pitched acoustic whistle, like a jet engine turbine at a distance, echoed through the gap. For 2 agonizing minutes, I was literally locked in a full-strength physical struggle against this door, my boots slipping on the carpet as I tried to force the timber back onto the latch. The force, though, on the other side felt immense and entirely, calculated. I was so terrified of what might be standing in the vacuum of the hallway that I kept my eyes focused entirely on the grain of the wood, refusing to even look through the 3-inch opening. Suddenly, though, the whistling sound stopped instantly. The pressure dissolved. The door slammed shut with a concussive bang that cracked the upper plasterwork. I dropped to the floor, jamming my back against the base of the door, and remained there in the fading light for 2 hours, until I heard the familiar sound of my father's key rattling in the front lock. I never did tell my parents. They were pretty traditional people, pragmatic business owners who viewed any mention of the anomalous as a sign of mental weakness, laziness, or craziness. I didn't bring it up as well until, last Christmas, during a dinner with my father. I was asking him about the old Manchester property, which we had sold back in 2015. I casually mentioned how much I hated the layout of the upper flat, and for the first time ever, I told him about the VHS tape and the pressure anomaly in the living room. My father instantly stopped eating too. He looked at me for a long time before leaning across the table. I never felt anything in that structure, he said, his voice dropping a bit. But you need to understand who lived there before us. The previous leaseholder, they were an elderly textile worker from Cyprus who spoke zero English. She spent the final 7 years of her life confined entirely in that back bedroom, the room where your brother and you slept. She passed away in that corner, in a bed, during the winter of 1980. My blood turned entirely to ice, but it was his next sentence that really got me. When we sold the property in 2015, the new owner, a surveyor who converted the upper floor into an architectural studio, called me to ask about the building's insurance history at one point. He told me that his night cleaner had refused to work the contract. She claimed that every Tuesday evening at exactly 5 o'clock, she would watch the distinct silhouette of an elderly woman walk out of her bedroom, move down the central corridor, and stand motionless outside of the living room door, waiting for the latch to click. And apparently, a few times, there was a wrestle over the door or something. Upon hearing that, I could barely contain myself, and I told my dad everything. I still don't know if he completely believed me, but he humored me, and he certainly didn't dismiss anything that I said. I don't know what was in that place or why all that happened. All I can say is that when we moved in 2015, I was glad to be out of there. In the autumn of 1983, I was 44 years old and managing a small, isolated timber preservation yard and a sheep property about 4 miles northwest of Monmouth, near the border of the Welsh Marches. Because of the wet climate and the age of the stone cottage that I was in, I routinely woke up at around 3:30 in the morning to check the pressure valves in the wood drying kiln behind the house. On the morning of October 12th, as I stepped onto the gravel yard, the entire valley was illuminated by what I can only describe as a dense, unblinking crimson glare that completely washed out the tree line. I walked past the equipment sheds and looked up toward the high ridge. 3 identical disc-shaped metallic structures were drifting in a rigid sort of formation less than 50 feet above the canopy. They were completely silent. There was no engine drone, and the surrounding leaves didn't even stir as they drifted downward. These craft were descending toward a decommissioned gravel access track that bisected a thick forestry block nearby. I followed them on foot, keeping low behind a stone drainage ditch. I dropped face down into a wet peat bog about 20 yards from a sharp bend in the logging road. 2 of these things had already settled onto the gravel, while the third was performing a slow vertical descent. It dropped down perfectly straight, settling alongside the others right in front of my hiding spot. The objects were roughly 3 meters in diameter and were exceptionally thick. They looked almost like heavy industrial flywheels, in fact. Each hull had like 4 legs that supported it. But the area was so intensely flooded by the light emanating from their undercarriages that the gravel beneath them looked like stark white, and it was sort of difficult to see the legs. Yet, the illumination ended on a sharp sort of clinical line, about 2 meters from my face, and then just didn't go any further. Around the perimeter of the holes were small windows. There was no sound of machinery or hydraulics or anything that I could notice. And suddenly, A section of the seamless metal hull on each craft slid open laterally into the internal framework. Then, a short single-tread metal ramp extended downward from the gap. 2 figures stepped out of each vehicle, emerging one by one in a deliberate sequential order. They were exceptionally tall, well over 6 feet, and were absolutely hulking. In fact, they almost looked completely out of proportion, they were so muscular. But it was their movements that made the hair on my arm stand up. They didn't move normally. Every gesture and every stride and every tilt of their heads was executed at like a fraction of human speed, as if they were operating in fast forward. They wore tight metallic grey suits. Their heads were entirely enclosed in smooth, featureless helmets, with what looked like a horizontal glass visor that completely concealed their faces. Where their ears should have been, the helmets featured these flat discs of dense, cross-hatched wire mesh or something that looked like that. Each one of them carried a heavy rectangular white implement as well. It looked a little bit like a pistol grip, I would say. The 6 figures gathered into a tight circle in the center of the gravel road. They began gesturing toward the surrounding ridges, nodding their heads in what appeared to be a briefing or maybe a conversation or something. Yet, even from 20 yards away, the silence was absolute. They weren't talking. There wasn't a single vocalization, in fact. Their physical exertion was obvious, though, and to take a single step forward, an entity had to sort of slowly hoist its boot several inches off the ground, pause, and lower it down with an agonizing calculated slowness all of a sudden. Now it was like they were moving in slow time. I lay there, though, in the freezing peat, panicking, paralyzed by the fear that their featureless visors would suddenly swing toward me. Through the open hatches of the craft, though, I couldn't see anything but a blinding, featureless white glare that offered zero structural detail of the interior. After maybe 12 minutes, these things began retracing their slow steps back toward the ramps, again moving slowly. They climbed inside with that same agonizing, heavy deliberation, crouching low to clear the narrow frames, and one by one, the hatches slid shut, becoming entirely invisible against the smooth hulls. The 3 craft then lifted vertically to a height of maybe 50 feet again. They drifted horizontally above the tree line at a casual pace before, suddenly, they just took off at an acceleration that is hard to even describe. Within just milliseconds, they were gone, leaving nothing but 3 faint streaks against the low morning clouds. I was now shaking so violently that I could barely push myself out of the mud. When I finally did, though, I ran back to the cottage and barricaded the door. In addition to managing the timber yard and our small flock of sheep, I was also a local magistrate for the county council and served as a lay healer in a small rural parish as well, a role that my family had held in the valley for generations at that point. And because of my standing in the community, I kept the incident to myself for, a long time. I was sort of terrified that the locals would think that I was going crazy. But on November 2nd, during a district council meeting, I pulled the local constable aside and admitted what I had seen in the forestry block. The report eventually moved up to the official channels, and the following week, I was quietly driven to a headquarters in Newport, somewhere, to be interviewed by a regional superintendent from the Home Office Intelligence Branch. They spent 4 hours reviewing my story, my background, and the physical measurements of the clearing even. In the official log, the superintendent noted that the witness is a respected public servant and long-term resident with zero history of eccentric behavior or fabrication, and while the nature of the event remains unverified by civil telemetry, the sincerity and physical distress of the observer suggests that he is telling the truth. I never went back up to that specific gravel track. The timber lease was handed over to a commercial logging firm 2 years later as well, but I still keep the field sketches that I made of the ground the next morning. And deep in the gravel, where the struts had compressed, were 4 indented impressions about 5 centimeters deep, I would say, each shaped exactly like each other. This happened to me a few weeks ago, but it still sticks with me, and it always makes me double-check all the locks now. So I was working an overnight security gig. I've been a guard for 15 years, and other than getting into brawls at nightclubs, happens more often than you think, I've had a pretty easy career, minus some contractor stuff that I did in Central America. The nights started the same way that they always do as well. I had gotten off my first gig and went to relieve the normal night guard, whose name was D. I arrive and D looks a bit frazzled. He's an old martial arts guy that works the apartment job for the same reason that I do, half off the rent. I walk in and ask him what's up. He says that he encountered a guy by the gate that, quote, gave him the heebie-jeebies. He asked if I would go back to my apartment and grab my carry firearm. I hesitantly agreed because, having worked in this industry long enough, guns rarely lead to good outcomes, but D is pretty scared, so I agree in the end. I go back and grab not only the gun, but my dog, a 120-pound Anatolian Shepherd. I suit her up in her harness and grab her cutie muzzle on the off chance that something does go down. I'd rather have the dog ready to go. I arrive and D is elated to get the heck out of Dodge, gives the dog her standard good girl chicken strip. This is a nightly ritual, regardless if it's okay or not, and takes off back to his apartment. I attach the dog's lead to my waist and we go on patrol. Now, I live in Texas and our apartments are sealed by gates that you have to have the code for, basically. I go and check the first gate and immediately come into contact with the person that D was so worried about. It's 93 degrees out, but this dude is wearing a trench coat with a hood, and before we even get near him, the dog starts going absolutely ballistic, hackles up in between my legs, snarling like some sort of feral monstrosity. I give her the command to chill, and she does, but what bothers me is the dude doesn't even flinch. I mean, most people see a dog that big barking and snarling and insist upon being no part of whatever it is the dog is protecting, in this case me. At this point, I step forward and initiate contact. "Hey buddy, how we doing? You alright?" The man turns to face me, and at this point, I see he's horribly disfigured. One eye missing but sealed up from surgery, the other eye a brilliant blue, and horrible scarring on the side of his face missing the eye. "Yes, I'm fine," he responds rather quietly, sort of in the way a child who's trying to fix something on their own might respond. "So, do you live here? Haven't seen you around. My name's H. You new in town, or has anybody ever told you that you have incredible eyes?" This simple statement made my blood run ice cold. At this point, I tap the QD on the muzzle and it swings out of the way. I'd like to think my mother used to tell me that, but I can't say it's something that I hear often. "Hey, listen man, you gotta get moving, okay? If you don't live here, I can't have you standing out here like this." At this point, he sort of goes rigid and reaches in his pocket. I don't give him a chance to do much more as I draw my weapon at this point. "Hey man, look, you gotta leave and I'm not telling you again. I don't know where the heck you're from, but I know it ain't from around here, so last chance, get out of here." He sort of slowly removes his hand from his pocket, and he's holding this little 35mm disposable. He lifts it, snaps a photo, and then says, "Have a good evening, your eyes are beautiful." And then off he goes. About 5 minutes later, I'm still shaking when the cops arrive. Turns out that one of the apartments close to the gate heard the dog going nuts, and they heard me raise my voice to our oddball friend, and they called. They tell me that they'll up the patrols and that they hadn't got any other calls about the dude, but that they would keep an eye out for him. So my wife and I had a couple of creepy incidences, and this one happened near Hope, BC, way up in the mountain. My wife was probably more freaked out than me, but maybe I'm just downplaying this. The second story, though, is something that absolutely terrified me. So, we were camping in the literal middle of nowhere between two mountaintops. It was forest fire season, so we could only have a small propane fire that night. We finally decided to go to bed, and we climb into our tent. We're laying there and talking, and by this point it was almost completely dark, when all of a sudden we see through our tent wall. It's not see-through, by the way. A glowing purple ball that starts where I assume was the tree line, and then up into the sky, and we could hear a light buzzing sound, and then it went silent. I grabbed my rifle and went outside, but I didn't see anything. In fact, it was almost as if nothing had happened. I chalked it up to a power line that had broken, but we've both explored that area earlier in the day for fun, and I can assure you that there were no power lines for, well, I don't know, there's just none really there. There's also nothing on Google Maps either, but that one is not that creepy sounding, I'll admit. But in the moment it was a what the heck is that sort of thing. My wife hasn't camped in a tent ever since then, and that was like 7 or 8 years ago. This next instance happened about 5 years ago. My wife and I flew down to LA and rented a camper van and drove it east to go to Zion, Bryce, and Dead Horse, I think it's called. But we were on our way to Moab from Bryce Canyon, and I was on the highway. I can't remember exactly where, but somewhere in Utah. I've planned our trip based on where we would camp each night. Everything was pretty much via Google Earth, so I couldn't tell what was what, but one of the places that I planned to stay at, we had to go down this dirt road for miles and miles towards something that looked like a cool camping spot from Google Earth. We get to the spot, and the thing that I saw on Google was a cool giant, and I mean a massive rock boulder, a very small mountain in fact. More like a giant hill, I guess, kind of growing into it. We set up camp there. The ground was untouched, and it seemed like no one had ever been there before because the dry soil was very soft, and you would leave deep footsteps in the dirt, and there were no tracks anywhere, not even animal. So I go to the mountain, and I collect some firewood for the night. I also collect some large flat rocks to make as a sort of wind guard, as it started getting very windy all of a sudden. We noticed some ravens on top of the rock cawing at us and kind of flying in a weird circle around the area. We joke about how maybe this is a warning, and how it reminds me of the Halloween episode of The Simpsons where Bart is a raven. Anyway, we eat and we go to bed. At some point though, I wake up in the middle of the night sort of randomly, and my body is covered in goosebumps, and my hair on my entire body feels like it's standing up. I start getting anxiety too. I feel like someone or something is just outside of the van. The wind is blowing hard and our van is rocking a bit from it, so that's making things worse. I'm laying there not moving in fear that something is peeking in when my wife says to me, "I'm really freaked out right now and I don't want to be here." I didn't know she was awake as well and justified the way my body is responding. But she later told me that she had chills and her hair was all standing up. I say, you know what, to heck with this, we're out of here. After mustering up the courage to move, I climb to the front of the vehicle to get it started and drive out of there, slowly as to not drive too fast and crash. We get maybe a few hundred meters away and the wind died down, and both of our anxiety and fear went away, which creeped us out even more, I guess. We eventually went back to bed, except I slept with my axe, like that would help, but we slept well and woke up at daylight feeling fine. And we both said heck no to making breakfast here, as we didn't want to get out of the van at all. The kitchen was only accessible through the back doors. I drove a couple of kilometers away until we felt safe enough to get out and take our morning pee. We were all shaken up from the night before, and we didn't know what the heck that was. We didn't see any footsteps in the dirt around where the van was parked when we were driving out there in the morning, aside from our footsteps which led to our makeshift fire pit. We were so freaked out by whatever happened that night before that when we got to Moab hours later, we actually rented a hotel and didn't want to sleep at all in the van overnight. Anyway, years later we were watching a documentary about missing people in parts of the US close to national forests and found out that the area that we were in was actually a huge hotspot, and that we were very close to Skinwalker Ranch. That's kind of crazy to me after knowing all the history about that place and hearing all the stories, but it's something that I'll never forget. In fact, I still get chills, even just sharing this. I never thought living alone in a dorm hall could be so unsettling. When I first moved in, I was the only resident on my floor, which was strange but not something that I dwelled on. The hall was eerily quiet most of the time, except for the man in room 217. He was a tall black guy, always dressed in pajamas, and from the first night, my friends and I noticed something wasn't quite right. We often heard him screaming, his voice piercing through the walls in the dead of the night. It wasn't angry shouting like I had thought at first. No, he was screaming for help. Every night, the same loud shrieking cry for help. At first we thought that he was just a troubled student, someone who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it in the right way. We even joked that he had serious issues, but deep down it disturbed all of us. His pleas were so loud, so desperate that they left a lingering unease. One night, after hearing that same shriek echoing through the empty hall, I went over to his door to see if I could talk to him. I knocked, but just like the other times I tried, the screaming stopped the second that I got close. The door remained closed, and the silence was deafening. The next day I went to the dorm office ready to tell them that the guy in room 217 needed serious help, but when I asked, the dorm manager looked confused. "There's no one living in that room," she said. "You're the only student in that hall." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew what I had heard, what my friends had heard. We had all seen him. How could there be no one there? After digging deeper, we uncovered the truth. Room 217 had been the home of a student years ago, one who had taken his own life. He had been struggling, crying out for help in the days before his death, but no one had been there to listen. Now, it seemed as if his spirit was trapped in the hall, forever screaming that same desperate plea for help that had gone unanswered in life. We also learned that the school itself had a dark history. Before it had become a college, the building had been a hospital during the First World War. The laundry room, where we had always noticed a foul stench and dry blood stains, had once been the morgue. The history of the place felt heavy, like it had absorbed the tragedies of all those who had passed through it. The screaming eventually stopped, but I'll never forget the nights that I lay in bed, listening to the ghost in room 217 crying out for help like that. It wasn't just a haunting in the end too. It was a reminder of how much can be left unresolved, how easily cries for help can be missed. And in that old haunted building, his was a voice that just wouldn't let anyone forget. So we live in the Philippines, and my family has a lot of connections and experiences to not just ghosts but creatures from local folktales. Almost every generation, there would be someone born with the ability to see ghosts, like my sister, who had a stronger third eye from what I've heard, but even without it, entities always follow and appear before us, especially in my grandparents' house, which hilariously even once caused a breakup to happen with one of my aunts. One such instance of these sightings was when one of my cousins, Elle, was hanging out in our grandparents' house, and for a while, she said that it was at least 10 to 20 minutes, was talking with one of our aunts. That day, they were the only ones in the house as the others were out, and she said that the entire time she was talking to our aunt, her name's Aunt Jay, not once did she speak out or react while she kept on talking and asking questions. After this, though, she went to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, but was shocked to see Aunt Jay in the kitchen. When Aunt Jay saw Elle, she asked for help in the kitchen, but Elle quickly asked her, "If you're here, then who was I talking to in the living room?" They both stared at each other just before they both heard someone call out, "Elle, can you come here for a bit?" in the voice of our Aunt Jay. Now, the saying goes in our country that you should never meet your doppelganger or you'll die. Knowing this, they both ran out through the back and waited by the front of the house. While waiting that thing out, Elle saw Aunt Jay in the windows of one of the bedrooms fixing the curtains and immediately told Aunt Jay, who was beside her, to not look because she can see her in the window, moving like a normal human. Not doing anything unusual or creepy, just there doing chores looking exactly like her. It's a story they rarely ever want to talk about because, well, it was a really freaky event for them. This is the exact same aunt, though, who, in her childhood, while sleeping with her sisters, saw a man with skin as black as coal with blood-red eyes looking at her through a window. She screamed and woke up her sisters, and they also saw what had scared her. My grandparents thought that it was some creep, but when they ran outside, machetes in hand, it dawned on them that the window was at least 2 meters off the ground, and no one in our town, or possibly even the whole city, could look or be that tall. Our great-grandparents had connections with authorities to the point that my grandmother never had boyfriends since the police always were watching her, so they would have known. The window was by a tree where the stories are told that is the house of different kinds of entities, especially of an unbelievably tall man, skin as black as coal, smokes a giant cigar, and would take, in some stories, kids, women, and in some rare cases, even young boys. When I was 17, many years ago now, I was on my way to town A-Line. It was pouring rain, cool outside, and I saw a girl who looked around my age hitchhiking and stopped to pick her up. I lived outside of a very small town at the time, and possible danger never really crossed my mind. She was kind of quiet during the 45-minute drive, so we listened to some music. When we got to town, she had me pull over at the gas station, and she pulled out this huge knife from her backpack, laid it on her thigh and said, "And I will never forget this. I was going to kill you and take your car, but you're a sweet kid. Don't ever pick up hitchhikers." Then she just got out of the car and walked away. I have never been so shocked and terrified in my entire life, and I've not picked up another hitchhiker since. This is a story that I've been wanting to tell for a long time. It's raining heavily now, so I decided to take advantage of that and tell it. I have to admit that I feel a little bit nervous about sharing this, but here it goes. So, the year is 2020. At the time, I was still going to school and also working. My sister was about 24 years old. My best friend used to come to my place for the weekend, and I always used it as an escape from work and school. I love spending time with him. My sister, although a little more serious and a few years older than us, liked to spend time with us too, and she also cooked while we played games, and it became a bit of a tradition. Now one day, a festival was held in our town, so I arranged with that friend to meet in the town. I hung out with my sister all the time, so I took her with me and we met together with that friend. We visited the parks in the city and looked for a place to just relax a bit, but it all became a bit boring soon. Near the church, I saw a house that looked kind of poor, but there was a lot of shoes there, as if the house was full. My friend told me that apparently a psychic lives there and works there and charges for his services and even heals people. And of course, being the age that we were, it occurred to us to check this out. I wasn't a believer at the time by any means, so even the thought of something like this was just kind of funny to me, I guess. But we entered that house though, and as soon as I stepped in, I smelled something wet, if I could call it that. Some people exited the room and others were waiting. The house felt very cold. To the right of the entrance is the room where the man works, and that's where we met him. In the middle of the room sat a man wearing a white suit. We greeted him, and without a word, he just pointed with his hand where to sit. After that, we had a light conversation, nothing too significant. After a few minutes, he started doing what we came for. My sister was the first in line, and it seemed to me that at one point she sort of fell into a trance, and I, the guy who only believes in science, explained it as sort of hypnosis, I guess. She started to cry and laugh, and she's doing it all as he says for her to do things. When she came out of the trance, he said that he cast a curse on her, and that the only way to get rid of it is to be with him in marriage. I immediately said that that was enough for me, it's time to go, and that he was a drug addict and a lunatic. Now, for 3 months or a little more, I planned a trip to another country together with my sister and parents. Live music in the car and we're driving, and as soon as we entered another country, the phone rang at the same moment, and to my shock, it was this guy. He began asking me why we were going to another country, if we were running away from him. We had an argument over the cell phone, and to this day I still don't know how he knew that we were in another country, or how he even had our number. After that, pictures of my sister with strange padlocks on began arriving at the address. There were dozens of pictures, and on each of them was a real padlock that pierced the picture and was attached to it. Eventually, we were forced to call the police, but really in the end they just couldn't do anything. There are still hateful messages from fake profiles, but the harassment eventually somehow stopped. I don't know how. I mean, maybe he got bored, or maybe he just saw that there was no fruit from all of the energy that he was expending, and he just stopped. "9 years ago, I had met a person that to this day I still wish I never did. I was an isolated, bullied, and depressed 8th grader, with the added state of being a plus-sized kid in a sports-centric town. So basically, I was beaten and ridiculed on a daily basis. I couldn't make any friends with my new classmates. All of my old friends from elementary school got placed in different classes, and nobody was in the same after-school groups as me anymore, and we were also all in a scout group, but that disbanded before I got into middle school. I was so lonely that if someone talked to me without picking on me, honestly, it made me happy. So I had a Google Plus account, the only social media I could access at school, that I kept hidden from my parents, that I would use to check out my favorite fandoms, and hopefully use to make some new friends. One day, I was on Google Plus in the computer lab, and I had commented under a piece of fan art of a character that I liked. The person who made the post had replied to me not even a minute later. I remember getting very excited seeing that notification, my heart swelling. The two of us spent the next 10 minutes of my class just sort of talking to each other in the comments section. We ended up replying so much that we flooded a good portion of the comments with our talk. After I had to change classes, I logged back in on one of the Chromebooks that we had stored in the back of the class and saw that she had actually messaged me. Her name was Haley. At least, she told me that was her name. Years later, I'm really not so sure it was actually her name. But in the message that I got, Haley told me that she was 2 years older than me, and that we had a lot of things in common. I spent the rest of the school day on my phone, not really caring about anything in my classes at all. We talked for the next week in our DMs until she suggested that we message each other in a private chat room. Later that day, we made a private chat on an online messaging site, and we had our first conversation in messages. Then Haley asked if we could also do a voice call. I told her that I wasn't sure about that, but she told me that it was only going to make holding a conversation better with me, and eventually, after she asked me multiple times, I gave in. After an hour of us talking, she then suggested that we video chat. I agreed, both to make sure that she was actually my age, but also to put a name to her face. Haley turned on her camera, and she did look in the same age range as I did. I don't know why, but that fact still haunts me more than anything else, really. The fact that she looked so close to my age, plus she easily smiled and spoke really friendly to me, made me feel that I had nothing to be afraid of, really. That led me to quickly believe, though, that I could trust her. We ended up talking for hours afterward, with me practically on cloud 9 the entire time. In the beginning of our little friendship, things were going alright too. We told each other about our schools, what we looked like, what we liked, and gushing over our favorite series that we liked too. We talked almost every day, and stayed up late talking nearly all night sometimes. We even exchanged a couple of silly pictures of ourselves and memes back and forth a lot. After we had been talking for about 6 months, Haley asked me if I would like to meet her friends. At first, I was kind of ecstatic, and the thought of having more friends made me so excited that I didn't think twice before saying yes. Haley invites me in, and I got to meet her other friends. I had a completely different feeling about these people, though, compared to what I felt with Haley. Something made me feel unsafe in that chat room, even though they all seemed nice and that Haley reassured me that I could trust them. It felt like my instincts were trying to warn me, but I wasn't sure about what, so in the end I sort of ignored it. Most of them, though, were much older than me. In a chat with her main friends, there were 6 other people. Most of them were at least 18 to 19, but there were 2 guys that I distinctly remember being in their 20s. I asked how they all met, and they told me that they all met either on social media sites or from real life, but really wouldn't answer any more of my questions. I was a bit naive, so all of the red flags that were popping up went completely over my head. But from constant loud talking to frequently overlapping each other, the calls that I was on with them were just pure chaos. The messages were even worse, though, because they would frequently drop cuss words and topics that really should not be brought up with someone who was still a minor. I tried building genuine connections with them, though, but they all acted dismissive to me and acted like I was just annoying whenever I tried to talk in a conversation. Needless to say, I didn't like them very much. Haley, on the other hand, was all about them. She would pull the exact same habits, jokes, dirty words, and all of that with the others. They could say something super problematic, but she would be laughing right along with them. I was shocked by this version of Haley because she never acted like this with me when it was just the 2 of us. We still talked a bunch, but slowly she was talking to her other friends more than she was with me. At first, I thought that it was fine, but the more she ignored my messages or didn't pick up my calls, the more I got bothered by this whole thing. When I called to confront Haley about blowing me off, she just went ballistic on me too, saying that I was being selfish and that I didn't want her to talk to her other friends because I was jealous. I explained that that wasn't true, but she just wouldn't listen, and then she hung up on me. Haley then ghosted me for almost a month, leaving me worried and upset over what had happened. When she started talking to me again, I was so emotionally distraught. I was crying on our first call and apologizing for what I said the last time we talked. She told me that it was fine. She just needed some time alone and that she would talk to me a bit more. And indeed she did, although not exactly what I thought she would do. Haley began to tell me that she had depression and that was the reason why she wouldn't talk to me for a month. I didn't judge her about it and just said that whatever she needed to talk about, that she could come to me. This led to her trauma dumping on me nearly every day, talking about her terrible home life and how bad her relationship was with her mum and how much she hated herself. I was there to offer an ear and some kind words whenever Haley called or messaged me about it, but this quickly became part of a routine. Almost daily, in the middle of us having any kind of conversation, she'd begin complaining about anything happening during her day. If not that, it would be about how ugly she thought she was, or how much her life sucked and wanted to end things. The last one freaked me out a lot though. I was worried about her because we lived in different states and I couldn't help her in person. Every time she would become self-deprecating, I would say otherwise, giving her compliments and words of affirmation for so long my throat ached and felt raw. And then, just as fast as she'd bring it up, she'd drop that conversation and we'd talk like we were before. Haley also began calling for long periods of time and messaging me late into the night. Phone calls would stretch for hours at a time and her texts would come in until like 3 or 4 in the morning even. The thing was that it was mainly her talking now. Like every phone call, she'd take over the conversation. If I didn't message her back quickly enough, she'd spam multiple texts back to back faster than I can read them. I would try to end them myself, but every time I would try, Haley would chastise me for wanting to leave our conversation when not long ago I wanted to have her attention. She basically guilt-tripped me back into talking to her, and honestly it worked. Even if I had lost interest in our talks, or didn't want her to message me during class, I would still let her talk and reply. At least I still had her attention though, and she still wanted to talk to me. This all went on in a cycle for 2 years, and it left me feeling more anxious and exhausted than anything else ever did. It felt like we had nothing in common anymore, and she either ghosts me for a week or spends the entire weekend texting me non-stop. The topics of her self-worth have also gotten worse. They escalated to her messaging me goodbye or I can't live like this anymore, without responding to any of my following messages or calls. Alongside of that, she would send me pictures of her, marking herself, telling me about how it felt to do it. The sight of those messages would send me into panic attacks, and every time I would panic and message her afterward, I would be sent into tears. Not only that, but the group chat with her other friends got worse. Arguments broke out frequently, drama and gossip spread like an oil spill, and it led to people being blocked, unblocked, almost every few days in fact, and I hated talking to them. They began ganging up on me in messages, and Haley was often the first one to make rude jokes about me that they would all laugh at. I began getting sick of it, and would stop messaging and calling both Haley and her friends, despite her begging me to. One late night though, while the group was in an argument over text, I hit my breaking point. I was tired of all the drama and them treating me like this all the time, so I messaged the group chat that I'd had enough of them and privately messaged Haley that I needed a break. Then I left both chat rooms, blocked everyone that I talked to, deleted my messaging account, and deleted the site from my computer's history. Once it was all over, I honestly felt like I had been freed from some kind of prison, and all I could do was cry in relief and euphoria over the whole thing being over. But here's the creepy part. So, I later found out that all of the pictures that Haley had sent me, that they were all stock images and photoshopped. I also found out from a bit of digging through her background, a lot of things just didn't add up. For instance, I learned that she was actually a lot older than what she originally told me, at least 6 years older than me in fact, meaning that when we first met when I was 14, she was at least about 20 years old. Many things from our interactions still haunt me, especially the pictures of her marks and her scathing, self-deprecating messages. In fact, for almost 3 months I would have nightmares about Haley getting back in contact with me and what she would say or do to me. I have better friends now, and I'm absolutely certain that I'll never have to hear from Haley again, but sometimes I still wonder who that woman really was, and what was it about me that she was interested in. Hopefully I won't ever have to find out, but I was lied to a lot by that woman. And now that I'm older and I look back on the whole thing, that whole situation was not okay and extremely creepy. A few weeks ago, I was driving in the middle of nowhere heading to one of my friend's place. My wife was sleeping next to me while my teenage daughters were watching a movie in the back. Next to them, my toddler was playing with his toys, and it must have been around 1 a.m. I was a bit nervous as the drive there seemed to last forever, and I was getting a bit tired too. The dirt road with no lights gave me chills as all I could see around were only fields. The road had many holes, and I was trying to avoid them as best as I could. I was very focused on that when I saw in front of the car a luggage bag. It was in the middle of the road on my side. On the other side was a car parked facing us. The car was completely in the dark, as there were no lights inside or outside of it. I didn't want to drive over the luggage, so my first instinct was to go out and move it. Man, was I lucky though that my wife was with me that day. She grabbed my hand and indicated to me that something just wasn't right. One person was in the field, looking at something on his phone, the reason for which my wife saw him in the first place. I turned the car around and I was ready to leave this road when 2 people jumped in front of us from the field. There was no space on the road, so I couldn't go without harming them. 2 people were in front of my car now. There was also the luggage bag, a car, and the person checking their phone in the field behind us. I didn't know what to do, so really I did the only thing that I thought of. I just turned around again, facing the luggage, and just drove over it. Fortunately, there was nothing inside of it to damage my car, so we got out of this situation unharmed. We eventually arrived at my friend's house, and everything was fine after that, and we had a great time there. But I still get chills when I think about this incident. I mean, the whole thing was pretty obviously a setup, and if I had gotten out of the car, what would they have done? I work with adults with disabilities, so do take this story with a grain of salt. But he would walk about seeing a girl with no mouth around the house. For example, when he couldn't find his hat, the girl with no mouth would take it. One of my responsibilities was checking on him when he went to bed each night too. I had assisted him with bed and left him with his mask in his lap and stepped out so that he could get it on and get comfortable. I had left his light on and his door cracked so I could just peek in, turn off the light, and had went down the hall a bit. I was about 10 feet away, just looking at a bulletin board when I started to hear him laugh. Curious, I came down to see what he was laughing at, and when I poked my head in, he said, "I caught you." What? I said. "I caught you. What did you catch me doing?" I was laughing a bit, lighthearted. I didn't want to worry him, but in my mind I'm just thinking all I was doing was reading about the company picnic or something like that. He said, though, that he saw a hand reach into the crack of the door and turn off the light, and he thought that it was me playing with him. Here's the thing, though. The light, his light, was actually off, and he hadn't moved. His mask was in his lap, and he was still sitting underneath the covers in the same position, same spot. He hadn't moved, and the light was off now. I had to flip the switch to turn the light back on. Now, I personally only ever had one experience there. I was in the living room watching a movie. The work was done for the day, everybody's asleep, paperwork done, so I'm just killing some downtime, keeping myself awake, when I hear this crash come from around the corner. Around the corner is a dining room. In the dining room is the kitchen table, and on the other side of the room across from the entryway is a client's bedroom. My first thought was that he had gotten up and may have fallen, so I hurry over to check on him. I get to the entryway and I can see that his room door is still closed, but I can see this through a figure standing in the dining room by the table, a figure that turned to look at me. Its right side was to me, and then it turned its entire body to look at me, and I could see through it to the other side of the dining room to the client's closed bedroom door. I absolutely freaked at this, backed up a few feet, and then it was just gone. That is the only experience that I've ever had at that house. I have heard from the overnight staff there who replaced me that she has heard whistling though. Now, the rest of this I could excuse. I mean, he had cognitive impairment, my eyes were just playing tricks on me perhaps. She heard whistling from the outside and it sounded like it was from the dining room. But I can assure you that that light, it was off, and I purposefully left it on so that I could do my job a minute later. Yes, he was cognitively impaired, but he didn't see things. He had trouble with his memory, but again, he didn't see things. And that makes me wonder just how much of the other stuff that he was telling me was real. This story takes place in 2020, before the pandemic started. I had been working as a package delivery driver for about a year at this point. During this time, the area that I worked in included the downtown area of Fresno, California. Like many cities, our downtown area was not the best place to be day or night. Growing up near the area, I was no stranger to the rough environment that I was working in. After dealing with shootings, the homeless, drug addicts, and drug dealers, it was easy to say that it would take a lot to freak me out. I have had some other strange events happen to me in my life, some things I can't even really explain, but none of that was enough to prepare me for what happened on this day. So I had made good time on my route that day, as I had begun to grow accustomed to the monotonous area. The thing with package delivery too is that after a few weeks, you realize that it's always the same place that receives packages. Today was a little different though. I had been given a package for a church on a busy street that I had never been to before. Even though I had never been to this church before, I knew exactly where it was. I was also aware that it was near the railroad tracks and a pretty large homeless camp. This is an important detail too, as it will explain some of my thought processes and actions at the church. I made my way there around 2 p.m, knowing that once I was done with this stop, I would have to shoot back across town to do my pickups, then head home for the day. So, as I arrived, I grabbed the package, locked up my truck, and made my way to the entrance of the church. Now, something to note here is that I am not a very religious person at all. Was pretty much force-fed religion my whole life, and going to churches is not something that I'm really that fond of. I usually feel uncomfortable at any church, so the feeling of not wanting to go inside was not uncommon to me, but I had a job to do. Standing in front of this church, I noticed that the huge double doors were wide open, which to me meant that someone should be nearby and I could get this over and done with. Normally, though, I would have found this a bit strange, as it is a rough area after all, but it is a church too. Maybe they left the doors open to allow people who needed help to come in. I don't know. In any case, I made my way inside and was greeted by a giant mirror from floor to ceiling and 2 more doors on each side of it. Looking around this small entrance area, I was expecting to run into someone fairly quickly. However, the place seemed, well, deserted. I decided the best thing to do at this point was to call out and let whoever was there know that I was inside the building. Typically, I did this to avoid startling someone, especially down here. And as I waited a minute or two with no response, I figured that maybe whoever was here just couldn't hear me from where they were. Spending more than a couple of minutes at any stop could cause a ripple effect for the rest of the day, so I decided that I would walk around looking for, well, anyone. I decided that I should start with the doors that were right in front of me, figuring that this was the main part of the church and a good place to start. As I attempted to open the doors on both sides of the giant mirror, I found them to be both locked. I looked through the small glass windows and just saw rows and rows of chairs and a main stage area. Deciding to head left toward a small entryway, I realized that the 2 doors in there were the bathrooms. I knocked on both doors, hoping to hear some response, but was met with silence. As I returned to the main area, straight ahead of me was a dark hallway that I could barely make out that made a left turn at the end of it. At this point, being the only way to go, I decided that maybe the office was that way and it was the only place left that I hadn't checked. I made my way down the hallway, still calling out, hoping for any sign of anyone in the building. But as I approached the left turn of the hallway, the darkness seemed to swallow any and all light that attempted to make its way down that hallway. It was now, too, that I began to feel a sense of danger and a small tingling feeling that you get when you can sense something just isn't right, but ultimately chalked it up to just the darkness being a little bit creepy. At this point, I decided that it may be best to pull out my phone and use it as a flashlight since I couldn't see one foot in front of the other. Drivers aren't allowed to carry any type of weapons, but at least I had my phone out. As I turned my flashlight on and held it out, I noticed multiple doors all closed. I should have realized that this wasn't a good idea, but the work ethic in me said keep going and we get to drop this off and get out of here. As I continued forward, still announcing my presence, I reached the end of the hallway and noticed a door on the right with just the smallest amount of light under the door and a sign on the door saying courtyard. Figuring that this is why no one had responded to me, I went through that door. Upon entering the courtyard, I was greeted by the brightness of the sun and a bunch of dried up flowers. As my eyes readjusted to the sunlight, I noticed that this courtyard was enclosed by a fence, so the only way in or out was the door that I came from, and another door that was staring right at me straight across from me. To my disappointment, I was the only one standing out here. Figuring that since there is another building, surely whoever was here had to be in this other building. Not knowing what to expect in this other building, I approached the door and began to knock on it. Again, though, I was met with no response and decided to open the door. When I opened the door, the darkness that was waiting for me, ready to embrace me again like an old friend, was there again. Hesitating to enter, I called out a few more times to make my presence known, but silence again. Returning to the darkness, I immediately retrieved my cell phone, luckily with the flashlight still on. The hallway was a sort of T-shape, meaning straight ahead of me was a fire exit, with an indication of the faintest red light above the door, and another hallway on the left. With my light, even more dim than it was in the other building, I made my way, still calling out. Reaching the left turn on the hallway, I could make out, door after door, that they were all closed from as far as I could see. Knowing that I was reaching my own limit of being in this place, I decided to call out one more time. Expecting more silence, I stood there in the silence, waiting and listening. As a few seconds passed, I had decided that I'd had enough of this place now, when a loud clatter could be heard somewhere in the building. Instantly, my body tensed up as I remained still holding my flashlight down the hallway, the fear that I had been ignoring now reaching an all-time high. Within a few more seconds, I heard something slam seemingly even closer to me than the clatter had been. I even thought in my head, yelling to leave now, but my body was frozen in fear. Another slam even closer than the last brought me back to reality though. The fear had finally won, and whoever or whatever was in here was getting closer to me with every second that passed, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. Running at the door that I had come in from, the blinding sunlight had never felt so welcoming. I knew that I couldn't stop yet though, because whatever made that noise in the other building was probably even closer now. I gave up trying to reason with myself that it was an employee and settled on some homeless or drug addict that had broken in and made their way back in there. Either way, I wasn't going to sit around and find out who this person was. I knew that I needed to make my way back to my truck, and I would just explain to my boss later that something weird was going on, and so I left. With my adrenaline still pumping, I ran to the other door and made my way inside the first building to make my way out. As the door behind me closed, I didn't bother to reach out for my phone, knowing the walk to the main entrance was only a short distance from where I was. As I began making my way down the hallway, my mind telling me to get out now, I was hit with what I can only describe as complete dread. I have experienced fear before, but this was something on a primordial level. Like, everything inside of me went off like alarms and my body had completely tensed up. A feeling as if something had grabbed my shoulders, my legs feeling weighted as if I was trying to walk through knee-high water in a swamp or something. I was met with an increasing amount of dread and sorrow that overwhelmed me to a point that I knew that I couldn't handle it much longer in this dark hallway. And then, all of a sudden, all I remember is I woke up in my truck, in a random neighborhood about half a mile away from the church, and I was covered in sweat and I was crying uncontrollably. I felt terrible, as if every ounce of happiness had been drained from me, replaced with just hopelessness and sorrow. I began checking for my phone, and as I pulled it out of my pocket, my flashlight was still on. Which means that whatever happened to me, it did happen, and it wasn't some bad dream, confirmed as well by the package sitting in my passenger seat. As I accessed my phone to turn off the light, I then noticed that it happened to be 3 p.m., which means that I had lost an hour of my life with no memory of leaving the church or driving my truck to the location that I was currently in. Not knowing what to do, I called my girlfriend, wife now, and tried to explain to her what had happened. Speaking with her, I could feel the sorrow and the hopelessness leaving me, and I was finally able to get a grasp of my emotions and stop crying. I reached out to my best friend as well via text, since we worked together, and tried to explain it to him as well, since he had had some encounters in his life as well, and I knew that he would understand, or at the very least, hear me out. I have never stepped foot in that place since that event. I have driven past it, been near it, but I never had another delivery there again. The package that I had for them was eventually delivered by another driver who said that there was somebody in the main entrance and didn't even have to go inside the building. I have since moved out of Fresno, and even before I did, I was moved to a manager position, so I wasn't really delivering anymore. But I still have flashbacks to that place from time to time. They've gotten way less frequent over the years, but it still freaks me out. Sometime later as well, I talked to a friend who is a paranormal investigator, trying to get some answers about the whole thing. She explained to me that it sounded as if something attached itself to me that day. That churches can hold a lot of energy, and given the location of the church, it's not surprising if it had its fair share of sorrow and pain from those seeking help. This story has always been hard for me to talk about, because even to this day I have a hard time believing that it actually happened to me. But when it does come back, I always find myself asking the same questions. Like, how did I get back to my truck? How did I drive about half a mile away, and what the heck happened in that hour of time that I can't remember? So, I'm into LARPing, and for those who don't know what that is, we basically spend the weekend in the woods dressed as medieval fantasy characters and interact with each other. I go to these events with my friend and my partner, and we meet some more friends when we're there usually. Now, there are all types of people at these events, but 99.9% are absolute angels. I had yet to meet the 0.1%, but man, do I wish that I hadn't. Before the event started, a guy named Greg swung by my tent while I was setting it up. My partner and a friend were setting up the secondary tent up a path and couldn't see me at this point. There were 5 other people to my right. I had never met the guy before, but as soon as he said hi, I had a bad feeling. He was around 5'10", obese, a neckbeard, basically what would fit the description of an incel. He approaches me and asks me if I'm here alone. I say no, that I'm here with some people, but don't mention my partner or friend directly. He asks if I'm a gamer, to which I say yes, and from then on, he starts rambling on Ark Survival, which is a game that I personally have like 3,000 plus hours on. He tells me blatantly wrong info though, misnames the dinos, tells me stuff that are impossible to do in the game, even with mods, etc. And every time that I correct him, I can see that he looks to be getting even more annoyed. I end the conversation saying that I have to go back to setting up the tent, and he leaves. Fast forward to around 10 to 11 PM, the event has started, which means that any mention of the real world, such as cars, TV, pop culture, etc., is forbidden by a rule called decorum. We're playing a campfire game with my friends and my partner, and the guy comes by to sit with us. He sits next to me. I move over. He scoots closer, I move over, and he scoots again. Eventually, I get up and sit next to my friend, and as we play this game, he keeps referring to the real world and to the video game, so we tell him either to leave or to make an effort and speak properly, and he chooses to leave. Now, the next day I go up a trail for fake hunting or gathering resources. As I come back down towards the village, in the middle of the woods with no camps that I can hide in, he's there waiting for me on the trail. He then asks if I would like to go and get a coffee or something sometime, to which I answer, no thanks. As we go down the trail, I tell him that I have to collect plants for my potions, so if he could excuse me, I'll be going back to the village to leave my bow and collect my basket. I'm walking pretty fast. He follows me though, grabs my arm and tells me that I could come with you. You, me, alone in the woods looking for plants. That's like the perfect scenario. I freak out at that and walk very fast down the trail to the village. My neighbors see me and they look very concerned. They ask if I need help and I tell them, in an honesty way, which is a code to say take me seriously, this isn't part of the game, that this dude is being extra creepy and following me. They take their weapons, foam weapons, and tell him to get lost before they carve him a new one. I stay with them for a few minutes before chilling with my friends. Night eventually comes and we're having fun, stuff is happening in terms of fighting and encounters. Then at around midnight, I decide to go to the bathroom. At that point, I haven't seen this guy since around 7 PM. As I come back from the bathroom in complete darkness, this guy jumps from a bush and pins me against a tree all of a sudden. He tells me that he's not proud of me, that I've been leading him on, that he doesn't understand why I would hold another guy's hand and hug 3 other guys but not him. I tell him that I hold my fiance's hand and I do hug my friends, but he's neither. I also tell him to stop this, in all honesty, to which he answers, but what if in all honesty I just want a little kiss, huh? Just a little kiss and then you can go. I yell no and try to hit him to get away. My friends, who were right on the other side of the bridge separating us, heard me scream. They took their weapons, called upon my neighbors, and around 10 people came careening down the bridge to help. The guy let me go and turned to my rescuers, saying that he was just interrogating me for information concerning the demons, our foes. My friends, who have seen this guy being a jerk before, tell him not to move, that they're going to get the owner of the LARP to deal with him. He tried to dissuade them, but my neighbors tell him to sit down or he'll be visiting Death's altar before he can move. I'm taken away by my fiancé, who is very worried and concerned about what had happened. The owner comes and I explain what happened, and he takes Greg outside the play to discuss. And from what I heard, he was kindly asked to not come back for any future events. This incident took place about 19 years ago. I was 16 when it happened, and I was living with my dad, just us. So fast forward 3 years, my dad and I were sitting in our freestanding garage smoking cigarettes and just shooting the breeze. We started exchanging stories, and he came at me with one that I had no recollection of, and I mean zero. While he was telling me the story, I actually thought that it was about someone else because I honestly didn't have access to the memory at the time. Here's what my dad said. So, remember when I was sitting in the living room around 8 p.m. watching TV and all of a sudden I started hearing screaming? I mean like screaming, top of your lungs type stuff. I jumped up off the couch as fast as I could, sprinted down the hall to your bedroom. I then said to my dad, "Wait, what? I was the one screaming." "Yeah, how do you not remember that?" "Well, was this like when I was really young or something?" "No, it was maybe about 3 years ago." I then think to myself that this is kind of freaky. I mean, it's freaking me out to be honest because I had no idea what he was even talking about at this point. So I ask him, "Well, what happened?" "Well, I ran down the hall as fast as I could because I thought that something was seriously wrong. The weirdest part was when I tried to open the door, I physically could not turn the doorknob, no matter how hard I tried, like somebody was holding it from the other side. After about 10 to 15 seconds, I was finally able to open the door. I went in and I turned the light on and you were standing on your bed, leaning into the corner of your room, just screaming with a horrified look on your face. After a few seconds, you seemed to snap out of it and realize that it was just us and you were okay." "What did I tell you happened?" "Oh, you said that there were all these things in your room with you." It was at this point when the memory vividly came back to me and my eyes watered instantly. On my end of the story, I was sleeping and I woke up to all of these tall figures around my bed. I would say that they were at least 6 feet tall, black robes with hoods pulled over their heads, and just blackness inside the hood. I don't recall seeing any distinct faces, but they were shoulder to shoulder, literally standing around my bed. Now, the way my bed was laid out, my bed was in the opposite corner of the room as the door, which meant that they lined up around two sides of the bed. I instantly stood up and backed into the corner of the room on my bed, and I realized that there were more behind them. I would have to guess that there were at least 20 in the room. Mind you, the room was about 10 foot by 12 foot, and so it felt like the room was completely full. I screamed for my dad to help me, and it felt like an eternity before my door opened. They never did touch me, but they gave off the worst vibes that you can imagine. Back to the doorknob. It was a standard doorknob, a cylinder shape that tapers in. The knob didn't have any locking mechanism on it at all and was not faulty in any way. This has never before or since been a problem, not being able to open the door, that is. But when my dad tried that night, something, for some reason, caused him to be unable to turn it open for at least 10 seconds. And that is the part that just really doesn't sit right with me to this day. So, if you can debunk this or give any insight, then I would love to hear it. I've told 3 people in total this story. 2 of them were involved that night, and 1 was my therapist. I'm a scientist, and although I'm spiritual and believe in ghosts, I guess you could say, or at least the possibility of them, I never really believed in demons or things of that nature. I did grow up in a haunted or ghost house, but since moving out, I have not experienced any paranormal activity, nor have I had any hallucinations or anything. And so I'm hoping one of you can help me figure out what the heck this thing was. So this summer, I wasn't really feeling well and was going to go to bed early one night. While in my pajamas, I saw the local Facebook page had posted about the Northern Lights being out. I had been trying to see them all year and I kept missing them, so I grabbed a light jacket and I headed out. Of note too is that I had no alcohol or drugs in my system, just to be clear. So I drive north and found some fields to stop in, but word had clearly gotten out, and every minute another car was passing, trying to find a dark area to see the lights from. After my third spot was wrecked, it takes about 10 minutes for your eyes to adjust, and every headlight started you back at square one again. So I jumped into my car and I drove even further north. I was on the phone with a buddy of mine, as I'm a single female alone at night, and he made me feel a bit safer. I hit the highway, and that was when I saw it. The empty abandoned land that was used by the military for some unknown scientific experiments that had just become public. I had been there in the daytime and seen some of the old bunkers there. Definitely something weird was going on, but it just so happened to be mostly an open field with no streetlights, making it the perfect spot to see the lights from. I turned down the gravel road and drove about a mile in. I even made the comment to my friend that this place was spooky and that these weird birds kept flying around. They looked like bats, but when they landed, they didn't stand like bats do. I grew up in the country, so the dark doesn't really bother me, and so I just kept going. I finally reached the middle and pulled over to the side of the road. No one and nothing for as far as I could see. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, took a few photos, and then waited for my eyes to adjust a bit. After about 10 minutes, right when my night vision was starting to work, the hair on my neck suddenly stood up. I knew this feeling, as it usually meant an animal was watching you. Again, I'm a country kid, so I know all about this. As I'm on the phone, mid-sentence, I turned to my left and my entire body froze. It was like the air was moving, kind of like a moving shadow, but my mind also just knew that it was something that was walking on four legs, but it was stood up. Possibly a dog, but it was translucent. I instantly started screaming and ran back to my car. I felt that thing hit my back and sort of bounce off, like it was trying to go through me but couldn't. But the second it touched me, it felt like a Dementor from Harry Potter had hit me, but worse, if that's even possible. I have never felt such dread and fear ever. I don't and didn't believe in hell, so to me death wasn't even that scary, but this made me feel like even in death I would never feel happiness ever again. I jumped in my car and sped down the road, still screaming and praying. I kept screaming for my dad and brother, both dead, and Jesus, I'm not even a Christian, to save me. The worst part, though, was that in all of the kerfuffle, I was driving in the wrong direction. I had to turn around and drive back to get out of there. I screamed the entire time for help, and at some point my phone call dropped. My service was fine on the way in, though, but it finally came back the second that I hit the highway. My friend called back asking me what was wrong, but I was still screaming and crying, and I could barely get the words out at what I had seen. I ended up driving all the way back into town, and I called a friend who lived nearby. I went to her place and stayed there for a few hours as I just tried to calm myself down. I didn't know that she was a Christian, and it was lucky that she believed in this stuff. I finally got the courage to go home eventually, and she gave me something for protection. I took a shower to warm up, but my back just felt completely cold, like something had cut a thin line down across my spine or something. There weren't any marks that I could see, but I had to sit in the shower with my back to the wall because I just kept feeling like something was touching me. I lost my voice for about 9 days after that and had to lie to my friends and co-workers about the reasoning why, because I had screamed so much. It's been 6 months since then, and I haven't had any weird experiences again. Sometimes, though, if something touches my back a certain way, I still have a bit of a jolt of panic out of nowhere. Other than that, though, I have had no other issues, but I really don't talk about it to anyone because, well, one, I feel completely crazy, and two, I don't want to bring attention to it as I don't know what I even believe in anymore, to be honest. And I think that enough time has passed that I just want to know if at least anyone else has experienced this as well. As a scientist, I know our minds can play tricks on us, and I'm fully able to say that maybe the dark tricked my brain, but I just cannot get over the fear that overcame me after it hit me. I've been scared in the woods at night before. I've camped and been scared something was watching me. But this was so much worse. It's like and it feels weird even saying this, but it's like I could feel it in my soul. To be completely honest with all of you guys, I'm still 50-50 on the ghosts or paranormal thing, but I do have a couple of experiences that I really cannot explain. One in particular has always frightened the heck out of me when I look back on it. So I live in Utah, and we have Mormon churches literally on every block and in every neighborhood. A lot of my friends growing up, and to this day are Mormon. I used to go to this thing called Young Men's, it's essentially Boy Scouts, with my best friend who lived directly next door. This was like a once or twice a week activity, and although I grew up in Salt Lake City, my family wasn't Mormon, but my friend was my best friend in the world, and we did everything together practically, and so I would tag along sometimes. It was just a rotation of weirdo Mormon adults who taught us stuff, and we'd do random activities. I believe I was 10 or 11 when I would go to these with him. Now, one time in particular, it was a big gathering of some of the families involved in that young men's group. Essentially, it was just a big barbecue on one side of the church. The event was mostly outside with some activities in the church. The other half was not in use, and it was pitch black over there. There were a lot of people, and the lines for the bathrooms were super long, so I venture over to the pitch black part of the church to use those bathrooms instead. I cannot remember exactly what time it was, but it was starting to get a little bit dark outside. That side of the church that I ventured over to was pretty much pitch black though. There was enough light outside that the glass doors that exit outside near the bathroom that I could just see enough to get to the bathroom, but that was about it. And it was now that I remember just getting this extremely eerie feeling in the bathroom while I was doing my business. I didn't think too much of it. I mean, I've always been a bit of an anxious person, and I'm pretty self-aware about that. After I use the bathroom, I exit, and I go to use the drinking fountain right outside of it. As I bend down to take a drink, I then get this overwhelming feeling of terror, and that something was wrong. I turn around, and there's this pitch-black hallway, and I see this little kid who is pale, has marks on him, and his clothes are dirty and tattered. I vividly remember that pale face with marks all over his body and tattered, dirty clothes. He walks up to me, starts almost giggling, and my first instinct was to ask, "Are you okay?" The kid looks at me again, giggles. He walks out of those glass doors leading outside. Those glass doors were leading into the opposite direction of where the party was, to another parking lot that didn't have any cars parked in it. I remember I was just sort of standing there in pure terror, and then I ran back to the party. I didn't say anything to anyone, but was just sort of looking for that kid almost frantically. I never saw him at the party. I remember just being sort of shaken to my core for the rest of the night, and that night I didn't sleep. I don't think that I told my friends or family about what I saw, because I knew that they would think that I was just full of it. I really don't talk about it much at all, in fact, because if someone had told me that story, I probably wouldn't believe them either, and I would also say that they're full of it. I also don't expect anyone here to ever believe what I saw, and I don't ever even try to convince people, to be honest, because it was just such a weird experience, and I really don't know what to make of it. I guess I just wanted to share whatever weird thing or experience that was. And honestly, it still shakes me to my core when I think about it. This is a completely true story, and just happened an hour ago. I wanted to talk about it somewhere, and really the only place that I could think of was, well, here. So, for context, my wife and I are on vacation in Mexico. We both honestly are loving it here, and this situation really doesn't change that, but I am definitely reevaluating security. Now, my wife and I went out for dinner and walked back to our hotel. We get inside of our room, are settling things down, etc., and a few minutes go by, and there's a knock at the door. A man quietly says something in Spanish in an inflection that's trying to get our attention. Think room service or something like that. My wife looks at me like wondering who would be at the door at this time. At this point too, I should clarify that we did have the Do Not Disturb tag on the door. Anyway, a few seconds go by, and there's another knock at the door. My wife signals for me to go to the door, and so I go over. At this point, we've made no sounds for probably a minute before and during the knocks. Just as I reached the door, the keycard unlocked the door and it opened. A dirty-looking man had just opened the door and is now about 2 feet from my face. I put my hand on the door to prevent it opening any further. I think he was as surprised as I was, to be honest. He starts speaking Spanish and I hear the word Wi-Fi somewhere in all of that. I say, "No hablo español." In broken English, he tries to ask if the Wi-Fi is down. My wife says that it's not. I'm just kind of shell-shocked though by what had just happened, and keep my hand on the door as he talks and eventually leaves. I shut the door and engage the physical lock this time. I usually do this, but we had just walked in and wanted to get the stuff set down. I talk with my wife as we try to gather our thoughts about what the heck just happened. Essentially, a man knocked, got no reply, then let himself in and asks about Wi-Fi? No, this was clearly a burglary attempt, and he has a master keycard and thought that we weren't home. A minute or two later after this went down and we've collected ourselves and understood what had just occurred, I pass this information to the front desk in case this guy attempts other doors too. They seem to take it seriously, but no updates beyond that. The fact that this just happened has kind of blown my mind a bit, and I don't know if I've fully processed it just yet. Like, what if we were back 30 minutes later? We probably would have lost some stuff, right? 5 minutes later, we would walk into a guy in our hotel room. What if we went to bed earlier tonight? Could have been asleep and the AC is loud, and I don't know if I would have heard the door knocking through my sleep. If it was going to go down, then surely the way that it did was optimal. But those ifs are just crazy to think about. I'll definitely be storing our valuables in a safe now. I should have done this too, I know, but we just recently got here. But lesson learned. In the future, stuff is going immediately into the safe and lock is getting immediately engaged from now on. This happened at the very end of 6th grade, on the last day of school before summer break. I only lived 5 minutes from the school, and since I knew the neighborhood really well, I decided to take a shortcut home this day, something that I had done before, but this time I chose a different route through a part of the neighborhood that I'd never actually walked through before. So, it was a quiet street, kind of off to the side, I guess, and it had this weird abandoned sort of feel to it. Some of the houses looked empty, like no one had lived in them for quite a long time. There weren't any people around. The whole street just gave me weird vibes from the beginning, but I figured that I'd be fine. I mean, again, I was close to home. As I was walking on the sidewalk past these empty houses, I noticed a car parked on the side of the road up ahead. The driver's side door was wide open. I couldn't tell if someone was in it at first, and honestly, I didn't want to find out anyway. I don't like being approached by strangers, especially adults when I'm alone. So I did what most people probably would do. I pulled out my phone and I pretended to be on it so that I wouldn't have to engage with anyone. But as I got closer to the car, I heard a man's voice. Excuse me. I glanced over, and that was when my heart dropped. There was a man sitting in the driver's seat, and he looked just like my substitute teacher that I'd had that year. Same build, same face, even the same missing tooth. But his eyes were pitch black. I'm not exaggerating one bit too. There was no white, no visible iris at all. Just full-on pure black eyes. And somehow, they looked natural. Like that's how his eyes were supposed to be. It didn't look like contacts or anything fake. It was just wrong though. The moment that our eyes met, I froze. I didn't say a single word. I just turned and I sprinted home as fast as I could. I didn't even look back. I still remember the way my body felt too. My stomach dropped and my chest got tight, like something was seriously wrong. The weirdest part though is that I had just learned about the black-eyed children and black-eyed people not long before this happened. I didn't even fully believe in them yet or anything, so to have something like this happen right after I learned about them, it really messed with me for quite some time. I'm 19 now and I still think about this quite often. People say that black-eyed people come back to visit you, and to be honest, I've been scared of that for, well, years now. I don't know if what I saw was really one of them or something else, but I know that whatever happened that day, it wasn't normal. And I know that it wasn't my teacher too. It just, well, it looked exactly like him. I've never told many people about this because I know that it sounds so unbelievable and unreal, but to the day that I die, I will swear on everything that it happened. This is going to be a bit of a long one, so you'll have to bear with me here a little bit. So back in junior high, I started dating this guy. He's now my husband. But since we were so young, we had one of those classic on and off relationships all throughout high school. And during one of our off periods, I was going through some typical teenage girl drama and lost most of my friends. This was during COVID, and with nothing else to do, I got into gaming and ended up becoming close with a group of guys that I met online. They also went to my school. Now, I know what you're thinking. One of those girls who only hangs with guys because they're less drama and all that. No. If anything, guy friend groups are more drama when you're the only girl. Anyway, I developed a small crush on one of the guys. His name was Kyle. Not my usual type, but he was funny and easy to talk to, especially after a breakup. I told him that I wasn't ready to date again yet, but that I liked him and could see things going somewhere, eventually. He did not take that well. He kept rushing me, wanting to lock something down, and every time that I asked for space, he got mad. Like, blow up on me and kick me out of the group chat mad. He'd start fights, try to turn the others against me. Didn't really work, thankfully, and was constantly checking if I still liked him if I took too long to reply. Honestly, it was exhausting. Clingy is fine, but Manipulative, clingy, not so much. Now, I had extracurriculars at the time, a life, and he acted like I owed him 24/7 attention. Despite all the drama, we kissed a couple of times, but we were never official. Eventually, too, I found out other guys in the group liked me too, and the whole situation just got really weird. So I ended up cutting ties with all of them in the end. Months later, I got back together with my now husband, and that really ticked Kyle off. He started posting music on SoundCloud and Spotify, basically painting me as the villain. Songs about how I led him on and how awful I was, etc. But I was happy, and so, in the end, I just ignored it. Now, fast forward to about a year after graduation. My now husband had just proposed, we were thrilled, posted the engagement photos, the whole thing. We got nearly 700 likes on Instagram as our whole high school anticipated this happening at some point. Then coincidentally, almost the day after we post the photos, Kyle texts me, asking us if we want to meet up. So my husband says, why not? And we end up going to hang out with Kyle. I know, it was a really dumb idea, but since my husband was about to leave for the military, we figured that it couldn't hurt to reconnect with some people before everything changed, and try to mend some old bonds, I guess. Anyway, Kyle picks us up. He seems insanely excited to see us, which is really weird since we don't really talk and we didn't leave on a good note either. We drive to the mall, walk around, grab some food, pretty normal stuff. We caught up on the year since graduation, but even during that I could tell that something about him had shifted. His smile just didn't seem or feel real, I guess. His eyes were off, like he was looking through us almost. We get back in the car and start driving aimlessly through town. It's late, probably around 10 p.m, no traffic and everything's quiet. And then, all of a sudden, he just starts speeding. Like, not a fun little thrill, no, he's pushing 110 in a 30 zone, flying through red lights, swerving around corners like he's trying to get us killed. I half laughed at first, thinking he was just showing off, but he just kept doing it. He'd casually mention how the seatbelts in the car don't really work, and how he isn't a great driver. And then came the real red flags. He starts talking about how he thinks that he's not wired like other people, said that he doesn't really feel anything when people die. No sadness, no guilt, just nothing. He even said, I think I might be a little bit psychotic. My husband, trying to keep his cool, kind of shrugged it off with an awkward, well, that's not good. But I remember sitting there, heart pounding, suddenly hyper aware of the locked doors, the broken seatbelt, and how fast we were traveling. He then starts bringing up just how badly I had hurt him when we were 15 and that he never really mentally recovered from that. Obviously, I said sorry and that I was a stupid teenager, but I thought that we were past this, since we had both made mistakes. The whole car ride was, as you can imagine, crazy and just really off. He was blasting these songs that he had made about me. Weird lyrics, obsessive stuff. My husband and I exchanged a glance, but we let it go. And eventually he pulls into this massive park in the middle of town, the one with that huge new staircase that they built on the mountain. No one else is around and it is completely pitch black out here. He goes, "Do you guys want to go for a walk?" We get out immediately and we start walking because anything was better than being in that car again. The stairs go high, higher than they look from the road. I'm already uncomfortable, but I go anyway. About halfway up, my knee starts acting up a bit. It's an old basketball injury, but anyway, I tell them that I'm going to stay put because of this. Kyle stops too and starts talking again, this time about how he feels like he never really got closure, how he still dreams about me, how he's never been able to connect with anyone else the same way. He says this, mind you, while my fiancée is standing right there, and the tension is unbearable. My husband tries to keep things chill, even jokes slightly, but you can tell that he's ready to leave and is getting a little bit worked up now. Eventually, Kyle keeps going. He walks way ahead of us and then yells back, "You guys should come up here. It's crazy. Just look at this drop." We glance up, and he's standing at this unfinished part of the staircase, near a ledge with nothing but raw cement below. One wrong step and, well, that's it for you up there. My husband looks at me and then calls back, "Nah, we're good. We're gonna head back, okay?" Back in the car, it is tense. He's fidgety, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. He then breaks the silence by saying, "If I had a gun right now, I don't know what I'd do." Just like that too, calm, cold, no emotion in his voice. Hearing that, my body suddenly locked up. I didn't even know what to say. My husband leaned forward and asked if he was okay. Kyle just gave a weird little smirk and looked away. He said, "I'm good, just making conversation." We were utterly spooked and kept mentioning that we were tired and ready to go home, but he just literally wouldn't take us. Finally, a cop car slowly rolls into the parking lot at some stage. Normal, right? We weren't doing anything wrong, but maybe Kyle was just unfiltered like how I knew him in high school, but Kyle loses it at this. Starts panicking, slamming the steering wheel, breathing quickly. He mutters, "If he pulls us over, just say that we were having a threesome or something." And I mean, what the heck, right? Well, we just sort of blink at him. I mean, that made no sense. We weren't high. We weren't drunk. We weren't even being loud. But he's acting like he's running from something. Or that something worse was going on. The cop doesn't stop us, just sort of passes us by. Kyle pulls out fast and then drives us straight home without another word. He doesn't even say goodbye when we get out. He just speeds off. "Hey, was it just me, or did it feel like he was trying to kill us?" I didn't even hesitate. "No," I said, "it wasn't just you." After that night, we didn't talk to Kyle again, like at all. But we both agreed that it was weird, too weird to ignore. My husband said that he just couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something really awful. And honestly, I felt the same way. The way that Kyle stared from that ledge, blank, like he was watching and waiting for something to happen. The things that he was saying in the car driving so recklessly, how freaked out he got about the cop. Well, the next weekend we made plans to meet up with some more old friends, the guys in the initial friend group where Kyle and I met. Turns out, they had cut all ties with Kyle too. I hadn't realized just how serious it was, but there had been some drama because apparently Kyle had been dating a girl, her name was Sarah, who cheated on one of the guys in the group, and things got really messy. Sarah ended up getting pregnant, but wanted nothing to do with Kyle. Sarah claimed the baby wasn't even his. Now that the kid is born, it really does look like the guy she says is the father, but still. Heavy emotional stuff, right? And Kyle, well, he didn't seem to be coping. We told them about our strange night with him, about the car ride and all that, the creepy conversation, the ledge, the cops. They didn't even flinch. In fact, one of them actually said, "Yeah, that sounds like something that he'd do." But then they brushed it off, like jealous maybe, but harmless. That was what one of them said. Still, the more that we talked, the darker it seemed to get. They told us that when Kyle found out that I was engaged, that he went off the deep end. full-on drinking rampage, punching holes in the walls, tried to fight another guy in the group who, by the way, is one of the gentlest people that you'll ever meet and is on the spectrum. Then Kyle just sort of disappeared for a few days, wouldn't answer texts, wouldn't call back. When he finally resurfaced, it was like nothing happened. Just showed up at their condo like he hadn't dropped off the grid after threatening one of their closest friends, smiled, laughed, acted normal. No apologies and no explanation. Well, weeks go by and my husband ships out for training. I stay in town but move back with my parents to wrap things up before I move when he's done. My parents live about 30 minutes outside of town, and it's a very, very small community where they are. They have about 3 acres of land, and it's a dirt road leading only to their house. I always felt safe there though, since we had cameras everywhere and everyone in the community owns guns, including my dad. So if someone was on the dirt road, my dad would sit on the porch with a gun, since we never had any uninvited visitors. But then I start getting messages from Kyle. Said that he wanted to hang out one more time before my husband left for the military. I told him that we were busy, and he didn't respond after that. But then, weird stuff started happening. For instance, one night I swear that I saw his car drive by the dirt road in front of the house. This was insanely strange too because, like I said, we're pretty secluded here. Another time, I noticed a notification from a random burner account viewing my Instagram stories, always the first viewer, and every time that I blocked it, a new one would pop up. No posts, no followers, just watching. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't him, but I knew deep down that it was. I start getting messages from another burner account. They're not threatening exactly, but they're just off. Long rants about people being fake, how no one really understands loyalty, and cryptic comments like this. You're lucky, he's lucky. It could have been different, but I let it go. Let what go? I don't respond. He then tells me it's Kyle, by the way. I figure that he's just spiraling, maybe going through something, so I block the account and set mine to private. After that, I never did see him again in person. He just kind of disappeared after that. No mutual friends mentioned him, no posts, nothing. Honestly, it was almost like he just dropped off the earth. Well, 6 months later, I reunited with my husband and we moved several states away to a military base, and life finally felt calm again. But then, out of nowhere, we get a call from one of the guys from the old friend group. A bunch of them were still roommates, so they're all together when the call came in, and it started like this. Did you hear what happened? What, is everything okay? Kyle tried to break into Sarah's house. I just froze. Why? Why would he do that? Well, he claimed the baby is his, said that she'd been lying to him the whole time. According to them, Sarah said that he had showed up out of nowhere, managed to get inside, and at some point, while holding the baby, had tried to take her. In the chaos, she said that he had somehow stabbed her, and he was arrested not long after that. That's probably why no one heard from him, and why he vanished. But then, it gets worse. The guys told me that when he was arrested, they found a notebook, and that it had our names on every page, Sarah's and mine. Obsessive stuff, pages and pages of graphic, violent fantasies about killing our significant others, about having his way with us in front of our husbands, and if he couldn't have us like that, he wrote that he'd end all of us together. It's been 3 years since then, and I still have nightmares about it all. I sometimes too dread that one day I'll have to explain the whole thing to my kids and tell them to be careful with their new high school flings, as it can either end like my husband and I, married together for 10 years, or like Kyle, still seeking revenge for a petty kiss and a crush 5 years later. I often think about that night on the staircase, about how he kept calling us to come up there, kept saying how crazy the drop was. What if we had gone? What if we hadn't have stopped halfway? What if I had never had that basketball injury, or my husband put his foot down? And what if that cop hadn't have shown up and spooked him just enough to, well, stop whatever he was trying to do that night? Maybe things would have ended up very differently. But they didn't. And honestly, I think that that's the only reason why I'm still here to even tell this story. The scariest part, for me at least, isn't what he did, but it's just how close we were to being the headline instead. I have so many encounters that I could share. I mean, I just seem to be a magnet for weird or creepy happenings, but this occurred when I was around 19 to 20 years old. Now, at this time, my life was a complete mess, to say the least, and I was under a lot of pressure. One of my favorite things to do was to go to a used bookstore that I've gone to since I was little, and you can exchange books there for some store credit, so I hadn't had to really pay for a book in years. This bookstore was in a strip mall, and there was a 7-Eleven where I would often get myself a soda and sometimes some cigarettes. The people at the bookstore didn't care if I had a drink in there or whatever, so I would often do that and just sort of browse around. Now, the men in there were probably in their 40s, and they were checking me out and making some comments. When I bought my cigarettes and the cashier saw that I was over 18, he said to me, "Wow, you're 20? I thought that you were so much younger. Doesn't she look younger?" And the other man working there agreed. It seemed like a bit of an odd thing to say, I guess, but anyway, I wanted to sit at the Starbucks across the street, but there was no seating. So I lit my cigarette at the 7-Eleven, and it turned out that the cashier decided to take his break and smoke at the time. I tried to be casual and not seem creeped out, but my guard was up, so I wandered over to the store to stay away from whatever that they were doing. I was in the bookstore for a while. Then somehow I lost track of where I parked. I swear that I could lose my car anywhere, but I was wandering around the parking lot and stepped between two trucks at one point. Randomly, the 7-Eleven worker stepped in front of me, saying that I had to come back in. I told him that I had to work in a pretty dismissive way and stepped forward. He repositioned himself so that I couldn't pass him without spilling my drink and walking under his arm. He claimed that the cashier really needed my number. He claimed that at 5 p.m. they were going to a party and I could come to the back of the store and drink until they left. It was around 4:30 at the time, I think. I told him that I needed to do work and again tried to move around him. He had taken a few steps forward, so I had less room, but I'm small and I tried backing up to go in between the other cars. After a couple of minutes of this, I decided to go inside the store because, at least it had cameras. I saw two cops walking out as the employee led me in. I wanted to stop them, but they were moving too fast for me to try and grab onto one of them or something. In hindsight, I know that I could have just yelled something, but I didn't think of it at the time. I also have notoriously bad luck with cops, so that just didn't feel like the safest option either. Anyway, when I came back in, they had already selected mini bottles of liquor for me. The cashier was explaining how this party on a Wednesday at 5 p.m. was going to be awesome and there would be substances and alcohol and I was going to have so much fun. I kind of aha'd and yeahed through that because I knew that there was no party. Finally, the cashier got around on what he wanted, which was basically demanding my number. The other employee moved to the door and the cashier was hounding me for my number. I decided that the best route was to use a number with a 555 in the middle, because apparently those are used for Hollywood phone numbers, but they tried to get me to the back, but I said that I had to work and I'd go to the next party with them. I was trying to placate them, but still just get out of there. Somehow, too, no one else was in this 7-Eleven, and basically I was fending off two creeps with nothing but a soda and a bag of books at this stage. I finally managed to appease them and exited, but knew that they would be watching me. I knew that I couldn't walk to my car and go off to Natty because I didn't want them to see my car at this stage. So I walked as calmly as I could to another store and frantically called the dad of the kids that I was going to watch. At this point, I broke down and I was shaking and crying, and his wife was at work, so he was really my only hope to get out of there quickly. He pulled up in front of the store and I jumped inside. I caught a glimpse of them looking out of the window, but I don't think that they saw me, to be honest. It wasn't until late that night that we went and we picked up my car. Friends who I have spoken to about this have different ideas of what they wanted. Whether it was trafficking, kidnapping, or just holding me in that gas station, I still don't completely know what it was, but those are for sure some of the options, and they definitely did not have good intentions. That much is clear. Looking back, I can laugh a little bit because as soon as the dad came, I noticed a hammer in his car and asked if he planned on attacking them for him to say, "You just never know when you might need a hammer." I'm thankful that he was there to help me. One day, some time ago, I went over to my aunt's house to sleep because, well, I had been out drinking all night and the night before as well. It was about 10 a.m. when I got there, and she had given me the okay to sleep in the basement. So I went down to lay down in her futon type of couch. I tossed and I turned for maybe about 20 minutes. I come to check the time, and it was suddenly 9 p.m. The basement had been very dim, just enough to make out figures of things in the basement because the light was on and it didn't really work too good. I laid there with my eyes closed, trying to fall back asleep, but I just couldn't sleep, so in the end I sat up and turned on her game that was on in the basement. Tried to play for maybe 10 minutes when I laid back down to try and get some more sleep. Same thing, tossed and turned for maybe another 10 to 20 minutes, then checked the time and it was suddenly 2 a.m. I then got up again and texted my cousin because he was supposed to pick me up. I got up to watch for him through the basement window. The window was about a half a foot or a foot higher than me. I jumped a couple of times to look out, and suddenly I got an eerie feeling, so I grabbed a stool and I stand on it. Suddenly, after a couple of seconds of looking out the window, there was a hard scratching on the concrete wall just an inch or two from my ear. I slowly turned my head and nothing was there, so I decided to go to the other window on the other side of the basement. Usually my aunt's furnace made 2 banging sounds every 30 minutes or so I was okay hearing that, but after the 2 bangs, there were 4 fast bangs right after that. I looked towards the stairs on my way over, and I swear to you that something had peeked out its head from behind them. I told myself, that's okay, it's nothing I haven't experienced before. But then, as I got to the other side of the stairs, near the other window, I looked, and there was this 7 to 8 foot tall shadow-like figure standing there, just looking at me. Again, I told myself, as long as you're not scared, it won't bother you. So I went and stood looking at the window. Then, after I got down and I ran up the stairs and outside as fast as I could into the street. Thankfully, my cousin had just started to pull up. I then began telling him what had happened as soon as I got in, and that is definitely the closest anything has gotten to me, other than my encounter with a little person, and I seriously believe that it was some kind of a demon that had evil intentions. I'm 22 now, but this happened when I was around 13 to 14 years old. So me and my mother were on a hike through Panther Creek Trail in northern Georgia. We hiked around 4 to 5 miles into the trail. Keep in mind that we had never hiked on an actual trail before, nor had we ever been to this trail or even familiar with this stretch of wilderness, as we lived in metro Atlanta. But our goal was to reach a huge, beautiful waterfall at the end of this trail, Panther Creek Falls. Now, there was a couple in front of us pretty much the entire hike, around 2 to 3 hours or so. Once we reached around the 2/3 mark, a couple in front of us were talking with each other and said that it was getting late and that they should probably turn back before it got dark. One thing that I should note is that there are parts of the trail that are very tight trails on the sides of hills which had no guard fences or rails, and the trail had a 50 to a 150 foot drop into a creek at the bottom, lined with huge boulders. Notably, there was a part of the trail that you actually had to sort of shimmy across, as it was only maybe 8 to 9 inches wide and on a rock face to boot. But anyway, back to when the people were talking about turning back. So my mum heard them talking about it and told me the same thing, that we best turn back. Being a teen who thought that he was invincible, I convinced her that I could make my way to the falls quickly and turn back to meet up with her on the hike back to the parking lot. She argued, but eventually she let me go. After another hour or so of hiking, I made it to the falls and took some pictures as the light was fading. Nobody else was there at the base of the falls with me, and I noticed it really started to get dark quickly, and I started to get a little bit worried since I knew that it was going to be a couple of hours to get through the trail on the way back. After an hour of hiking, I was in complete darkness, with my only light being the one from my phone. I did bring a backpack with water, a knife, and some other little bits and bobs. It was a completely non-moonlight night, and the only way that I was going to navigate was by pointing my light at the ground to see the trail to keep on it. Now, at one point, I will admit that I started to get really scared by the noises of the animals and the forest sounds, so I decided to pull my knife out of my backpack. I held the knife the majority of the 3 to 4 miles until I got to the part where you have to sort of shimmy across, and so I had to put my phone light in my pocket so that I could have a hand free to grab the rock and shimmy across. As I did so, my knife unfortunately fell out of my hand, and it made no noise for over 10 seconds, then hitting a rock with a metallic sound way down. And I knew then that if I fell, I was done for. Luckily, I made it across and managed to get back onto the trail. Getting my bearings, I looked at my phone to try and get some service and call my mum or the police or something, as I felt like I was in an extreme sort of danger situation. I mean, I could barely see the trail at this stage. I looked though, and I saw my phone battery was on 3%. This being the only light source made me start to panic to the point of tearing up a bit. I continued on the trail with my battery slowly fading as I used the flashlight. As I was walking, the phone flashlight only lit up about 2 to 3 feet in front of me. I mean, it was pretty much pitch black at this stage, a darkness that I have never before or since experienced. Then, just as I was walking, out of the darkness in front of me, there was a man. He was walking toward me from the opposite side of the trail, from the direction that I was heading in. I literally jumped at the sight of him as it was so instant. And that's when I noticed. He had no flashlight, a small sport backpack, and an absolutely emotionless face, and dead eyes staring completely past me. When I saw him and he scared me, I immediately said, "Oh, hey, what's up, man? I'm trying to get out of here." He never said anything as he passed me. I looked back, expecting him to turn back and sort of talk to me, but he never did. In the moment, I thought that it was so strange, and then I thought about it and realized, how the heck is anyone supposed to navigate this trail and its many challenges at night in pitch black darkness with no flashlight? To this day, I still think that there was no way that anyone could navigate that trail at night with no light source, familiar or not. It was then, too, that I got a terrible gut feeling about him, and I started running off at the trail through the trees towards lights and the sounds of cars in the distance. After a couple of minutes, I finally found myself on the side of the highway, where I then used a little bit of my battery to call my mum, and she was crying and asking me where I was, and she ended up picking me up at the gas station 2 miles away from the trail entrance, running over my foot to boot as an accident in a moment of panic to get me in the car. I later told her the whole story, and since then we haven't hiked since. We're not good at it, have no experience, and quite honestly, this whole thing just scared both of us. I still don't know if the guy was a ghost, a person just trying to catch people on the trail and do things to them or something, or maybe just a figment of my imagination. But quite frankly, I didn't care to stick around long enough to find out. This happened on a quiet Saturday at Southwest Minnesota State University. The campus was practically empty. No classes, no students in the hallways, just silence. Now, I had 30 minutes before work on campus and didn't feel like walking all the way back to my dorm, so instead I decided to rest on a couch in one of the main buildings. I wasn't tired, not even sleepy. I just wanted to sit in peace before my shift started. So I got comfortable, closed my eyes for a moment, not asleep, just resting. And then, out of nowhere, I felt someone gently tap my shoulder. When I looked up, I was startled. I hadn't heard any footsteps, no sound at all, and yet there he was. A bald man that I didn't recognize at the time. He asked me, "Where's the social science building?" I thought that was a bit weird. Everyone on campus knows where that is, and it was only an 8-minute walk from where we were. I told him, though, that it's at the far end of the building, and he just nodded and walked away. But here is where things get a bit strange. So about a minute or two later, I suddenly found myself in the social science building on the upper level. I had no memory of walking there, though. No stairs, no connected hallways, just sort of a jump. One moment I was on the couch, the next upstairs in a building that I've been learning in for 3 years, and I couldn't even recognize it. I was disoriented, lost. Something felt off, like I was trapped in a place that I thought that I knew, but I couldn't find the way out, and I felt weird. I decided to go downstairs and to try and leave the building, and that was when I heard running from behind me, fast, heavy footsteps. I turned, and it was him, the bald professor, running directly toward me. Fear suddenly took over. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door and ran straight to the cafeteria, one of the few places on campus where people were actually found. When I looked at the time, only 12 minutes had passed, but what I experienced felt so much longer, like I had been gone or disconnected from time. Later, too, I found out something that made my skin crawl. That professor had been teaching in the social science building for 9 years. So, why did he ask me where it was? And that wasn't the only strange part. You see, in the week before this happened, that same professor had been coming to the campus where I worked. Not once or twice, but multiple times during every shift. buying things worth $1 or less. Just cheap little items, always while I was working, always watching and always present. At the time, I didn't think too much of it, but after the incident, it hit me. He had been watching me. After the day that he chased me in the building, though, I never did see him again. Not at the store, not at the campus, nothing. To this day, too, I still don't know what really happened. Maybe it was psychological, maybe spiritual, maybe something else entirely, but I do know this. That day I was pulled into something, like a trance-like state, a test, a glitch in reality if you want to call it, and I thankfully made it out. Whatever was waiting at the end of that empty building, I don't think that I was supposed to reach it, and thankfully I never will.